Can I remind members that they must declare any relevant interest before asking questions or tabling amendments? So I'm the third person I think you've had in the chair for this bill committee, but we're continuing with our witnesses. If there's no further questions, we'll now hear evidence from Dr. Malcolm James, and we've got until 2:20 for this particular segment. He's a tax and accountancy specialist, formerly senior lecturer in taxation and accountancy at Cardiff Metropolitan University. And before I call the first member, can I remind members to remain within scope of this bill, which is actually quite tightly defined, and we've got to stick to these timings, so until 20 past. Malcolm James, yeah. Oh, sorry, no, we're going to... No, there's no opening statement. Sorry, which member would like to catch my eye first? We're doing it on the catching of the eyes.
David.
Shadow Minister.
Yeah. Thanks very much indeed, Dr. Huck. Welcome, Dr. James. May I start by asking you to give a view of what you consider to be the impact this bill will have, in particular with reference to high streets, if that's possible.
It was reference to the private schools.
I think at this stage, primarily, we're looking at correct, high streets, or are we specifically going to schools in this session? Okay. Fine. Okay. So I think in this session we've been covering in evidence taken so far, both in respect of private schools and in respect of high streets. Am I correct? You're a tax and accountancy specialist, so you have a broad overview. Is that correct?
Well, yeah. Yeah, I think that sort of particularly with the private schools are, the vast majority are charitable institutions. As such, they have no owners. Therefore, the effect of tax will actually have to be borne in one of two ways. Either the institutions will need to bear the cost by a reduced surplus, or they will need to pass it on in whole or in part to the families of the pupils by raising their fees. It's clearly no coincidence that this bill follows hard on the heels of the imposition of VAT, which is going to come into effect still, I believe, beginning of next month. And there's been an awful lot of coverage of one sort and another about the effect of this change. And we're looking at the removal of the something like 80% discount in non-domestic rates, which will increase their property taxes. And whilst it's doubtless not going to be as significant as the imposition of VAT, it will sort of have an effect. Because either that they've got to absorb it, or they've got to pass it on to the families of the pupils.
Thank you very much indeed. If I may perhaps follow that up, Doctor. So there's obviously been a very extensive debate about the VAT, although that is outside of the scope of this particular bill. We have spent a good deal of time debating, in particular, the impact on special educational needs schools, a very significant proportion of which are in the private sector. Some paid for directly through fees charged to parents, some paid for through educational healthcare plans supplied by a local authority. Do you have a view about how the measures in the bill will impact on special educational needs provision?
I have every sympathy with the families of children with a variety of special needs, and I do not want to see them suffer in any way. But if I sort of bring in a point about one of the points that the private schools make about how the parents are sort of virtuous and self-sacrificing by paying again for education, and thereby relieving the state of a burden. in this country, unlike other countries like in Europe, the Eurozone, we have a sovereign Bank of England which creates the pound sterling. It is not revenue constrained, even though the government often usually tends to behave as if it were by convention. But there are real economic factors which restrict the amount that it is wise for the Bank of England to produce or allow the government to spend into circulation. But the availability of money is not a limiting factor. There is therefore no reason why the state cannot provide the sort of special education with the special educational needs. There is no inherent reason why it can't. It's just, it seems it's chosen not. Various governments of various complexions have chosen not to. But the question always comes about the transitional, because the transition, because things, whatever we do, things aren't going to change overnight, and you don't want to disadvantage those pupils who are currently in the system or who will shortly go into the system. But there are workarounds, because I don't know if you remember, there was going to be a parent of a child with special needs who was going to be one of the people put forward to sort of front a judicial review challenging this, and she pulled out when significant funding was found. So there are workarounds if the will is there. But I think in the longer term, there is no reason why, the inherent reason why it has to be done by the private sector.
Okay, but there is no Lib Dem with us. Anyone else in like this minister?
Thank you, Doctor, and thank you for giving time to give evidence today. We're particularly interested in what evidence you have amassed on the impact of this and where you think the government might want to focus in mitigating the impact during the course of the process that we are in. If I take what I think have heard, the evidence you provided is a starting principle that, well, we don't need to go here as a government because there are plenty of other options. But the fact is that we have chosen to go here. And so what we're trying to get from the evidence sessions is, within the decision that has been taken...
I'm sorry, I'm sort of having a bit difficulty sort of hearing what you're saying so distinctly.
I think rather than hearing a case from the evidence sessions that asserts that this doesn't need to happen,
yes,
which is what we've just spent 5 minutes doing, it would be helpful to get a sense from you, because the decision has been taken to do this, but within the scope of what is being proposed, what is your assessment of the impact, and what mitigations might you propose to counter that?
Well, so for schools providing for special educational needs, well, you can always actually sort of amend the bill to exempt certain types of schools, or maybe certain situations with certain sort of pupils, because there is a bigger question of social justice in the fact that it is well known that the alumni of private schools are disproportionately represented in all sorts of professions, including Parliament. And I have a quote here in this paper about saying that they actually know that what parents are paying for is lifelong membership of an exclusive and superior club. Talk about saying the quiet bit out loud. So is that then we can provide sort of scholarships, we can provide exemptions for special educational needs, but those are provided.
but those are provided in the scope of the legislation that's being proposed. Schools with more than half of their intake of children in that situation would be exempt.
Well,
for those who are in receipt of a local authority, the HCP, that is funded by the local authority.
That means is that how far is there a problem with this, and how far is that this is being used as a sort of stalking horse to try and frustrate the bigger objective of reducing social inequalities.
But if it is a stalking horse, it's a fairly mild one, isn't it? Because the impact, even if every pound was passed on per pupil, it's just over £300 a year. It's less than £1 a day.
I'm sorry that I'm in difficulty hearing distinctly what you're saying.
That's what I'm trying to get through, because these are evidence sessions where we're trying to glean insight that we haven't previously got to inform the course of the bill and any potential changes that might come. But I'm struggling to get, from the evidence so far, a real sense of the impact, because if it is the pound for pound impact on this particular measure, which is the business rate treatment for private schools, it amounts to, on average, just over £300 per pupil if it was passed on in its entirety, which is less than £1 a day. So on that basis, what is the assessment that has been made on the impact of that from your perspective?
Well, I haven't actually looked at the impact in detail of this particular measure. I've looked at sort of the impact of the taxation in general, but not necessarily
this particular tax. But it is an evidence session on this bill on this measure, I would say.
Sorry.
I'm happy to conclude my remarks.
I see Jane Kirkland. I think if we speak close to the mic, it will pick up because he's not hearing. Jane.
Yeah, I'm just going to a go to try again, really, just to so you're talking about EHCPs, and you're saying that this might impact on some of the children, the parents with EHCPs. The bill actually sets out that private schools are wholly or mainly concerned with provision of education for children with EHCPs will retain their relief. So do you think there will be, considering that, do you think there will be much impact to those children? Do you think they will have to, do you think that will mean they would have to move schools? I mean, considering that measure is in there.
Well, if they're retaining their relief, then hopefully they shouldn't have to.
Okay.
And it would be very detrimental, particularly for people with children with particularly certain types of SENs, to have to move schools.
Okay, thank
Be,
you.
not just to necessarily the state sector, but move schools full stop.
Any more questions for Dr. James from any of our members? In that case, we can move on to our next witness. So I think we finished for this panel. Thank you, Dr. James. So we'll do change of seating. We'll now hear oral evidence from UKHospitality. I think we have a whole panel of people from there. Well, we have, in fact, the British Institute of Innkeeping, the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, so 3 different witnesses, and we've got until 3:05 for this session. Can the witnesses take their seats and introduce themselves to us? Who's missing? Is that the Greater Manchester person? No. Okay, so Sacha Lord from Greater Manchester Nighttime Economy is on his way, we are reliably informed. But in the meantime, can our 2 witnesses introduce themselves?
Good afternoon, I'm Kate Nicholls. I'm Chief Executive at UKHospitality, which is the national trade body that represents hospitality businesses. We have 750 member companies. Between them, they operate 150,000 outlets across all parts of the UK. Single-site independent pubs, bars, cafes, restaurants, nightclubs, hotels, right the way through to the largest national and international chains.
Good afternoon. I am Steve Alton. So I'm the Chief Exec of the British Institute of Innkeeping. So we're a professional membership organisation for individuals in the licensed trade. 13,000 members, the vast majority of which run single pubs independently across the whole of the UK. So we provide obviously a suite of services supporting their professional advice that they may need, all the way through to providing platforms to celebrate what great pubs do in communities, through to qualifications and apprenticeships as well.
Brilliant. Okay, so as I say, we've got till 3:05 for this block of questions. I start with Shadow Minister David Simmons.
Thank you, Dr. Huck, and welcome to both of our witnesses. We're aware as a committee that the sector you represent is very significant in the UK economy. Would you be able to give us an indication of how you assess the impact of the measures in this bill on the businesses and organisations that you represent?
Thank you. Should I go first? If we're looking specifically at this bill in particular and just those measures, I think hospitality is overtaxed when it comes to business rates. It has been for some time. If you look at the system without reliefs, hospitality pays around 12-13% of all business rates, but represents 5% of GDP. If you look at the system with rates relief, the high street businesses, hospitality and retail, even with those reliefs, pay 34% of all business taxes. So it's a disproportionate burden, and it's grown over time, particularly because you've got a move towards more online businesses, whereas ours are bricks and mortar, and they are in prime locations. You can't provide our services online, and so we are in those high street locations where they're heavily invested, and for hotels and pubs they are taxed for business rates on the basis of their turnover, and they can be very high turnover but very low margin businesses, and therefore they bear that disproportionate burden of tax. So reliefs have been in place for quite a considerable period of time through the COVID pandemic. They have been a vital lifeline, but reliefs are annual discounts, and they are sticking plasters, and they show that the system as a whole is failing, and a systemic failure needs a systemic solution, and this is a systematic solution to the problem that we've got, because it seeks to permanently rebalance the online and the offline, bricks and mortar, clicks and mortar, so that you can have a permanent discount. And the fact that it is permanent means that you can have certainty and stability for those businesses to be able to invest over a 3 to 5 year rental period, and over the period of a revaluation. So this is undoubtedly welcome. It's a change that we've been pushing for quite a considerable period of time, and it will materially impact and benefit those businesses that we're looking to support, the high street businesses that are so vital to employment across our communities, for the longer period of time.
Thank you.
So I'd agree with my colleague on the core points. Pubs, I think, uniquely are disadvantaged from two reasons. One, they have to occupy those buildings at the heart of communities and high streets. And secondly, they employ huge amounts of people, many at their first job and many part-time workers, which is why contextually, I appreciate it's outside the scope of the bill, the impact on the NICs, which is National Insurance Contributions, which is hitting employees incredibly hard because of the large proportion of part-timers that we support in our industry. So business rates is business critical. It has been in terms of relief levels. So last time when we achieved the 75% relief, that saved a huge amount of pubs. That said, because of the compound impact of energy, which is still ever present, and we're paying double the rates we were pre-pandemic, there's still a structural issue in that market. In addition, food and drink inflation has had compound inflation within it, so we've been running at 20% a year for the last couple of years. And then obviously labour costs, whilst we pride ourselves at paying above the minimum wage in many scenarios, we have many stepping on points in our trade for the start of careers, be that front of house, back of house, but we pride ourselves on accelerating those people forward. But obviously we need a large number of those individuals within the business. So the business rates was key in terms of the relief we received, but even with that, it's been pretty perilous. So even before the budget, we check in with our membership on a regular basis. Only 1 in 4 was actually making a clear profit, and half were at best break even. And this is before the measures announced by the government. So the compound impact of those announcements has now driven our membership to believe that they're going to be 80% unprofitable. They're already cutting paid hours by 75%. So 75% are cutting paid hours. 1 in 3 is making redundancies, and 1 in 4 fears at this point that they're going to be untenable when those costs come in, and they will fail as a business. And bear in mind, most pubs average will have 15, 20 employees. That's a huge impact to communities, and particularly disadvantaged individuals who start their careers not with any great secondary education, but with capability and character, and we can give them that professional development. So having certainty and a long-term reduction in business rates is absolutely critical for planning, because right now investment is being held. That's in property, in the evolution of the pub. The pub is a very different vehicle to 20 years ago. You know, if you're a non-drinker, you have particular food that you wish to eat, or you just want to go for an event and connect to a community, you know, again, safeguarding against, you know, loneliness and isolation, which are real present issues. We provide that community service for many, many reasons, and have evolved the model. You know, as I say, the pub is no longer a drinks-led venue. Don't get me wrong, we're still very proud of what we do around great beers and from the locality, but we offer so much more. So the commitment to the relief has been a lifeline. It would be great alongside this bill to see that full level of relief continued, because it will drop off on the 1st of April, and that effectively doubles the rate, you know, the rate cost being paid by small operators. And when 80% are unprofitable, that might be the straw that breaks the camel's back, and unfortunately we'll lose some long-term viable businesses through, unfortunately, no fault of their own market dynamics, have put them in a very difficult position. But we welcome the bill. I think having the 2 tiers and having that permanent and that surety of that reduced business rates. But as ever, I think Kate alluded to, we need to reduce the overall tax burden. You know, for every £3 that go across the bar, 1 is coming to government in taxation. And that's too much, and a rebalancing of that, and this bill is key as part of that, will unleash investment in people, property, and provide that community service on an ongoing basis, where the pub is probably the last true place that's accessible for all people in the community to come together.
So if I may follow that up with a further question, specifically around pubs and hotels. I think one of the things we're aware of is that the nature of the premises often doesn't lend itself to easily conversion into another business use, unlike a lot of retail shops, for example, which could change between offices and different kinds of business using them. In terms of sustainability, which Mr. Alton, you particularly highlighted as a concern, given that although it embeds it permanently, this does represent an increase in the business rates cost. What further steps would you like to see taken to help to ensure that that sustainability, particularly around hotel and pub premises, is actually supported through the system?
I think just building on that point from a pub perspective, it is just rebalancing of the taxation overall for pubs and making it fair. So how that's achieved, we've always consulted with both the Minister and officials across government around solutions to that. Now, our members would always argue for VAT on pub sales because they saw that support in the pandemic, and it's an instant injection of cash in their business. And it wasn't about profiteering, because as Kate has alluded to, this is a low margin business. It needs to be profitable because they need to continue to evolve the model and invest in what they're doing. And we all want to go to those great pubs that do exist. And some of them are, despite all of these challenges, doing very well. But they're the outliers. And it's the mid-pack operators now who've been doing it for decades, who've had a very long-term viable business that now face quite frankly, some very tough decisions, and we're incredibly concerned. In January, at the moment, they're all busy looking after customers, and that's great. You'll see pubs being at their best. In January, when it gets quiet, and they reconcile the numbers, and there's a head over heart moment, I fear we're going to lose a lot. And if it's 1 in 4, that could be up to 15,000 pubs that we lose, and they will not recover because they'll get boarded up, and you see them in all your communities that you represent. They don't go back. And when that happens, you have a whole rack of associated issues about social deprivation, disorder issues. We work very closely as an industry with schemes like Best Bar None that is all about accrediting safe spaces for socialising, and through that sees the positive impact of hospitality, increased footfall, lower crime, lower social disorder, and people feeling safe because there's people out and about in those communities and high streets. So absolutely key.
Could I add to that as well, because I think there are some elements that are there. This is a really welcome first step, but the pledge is for root and branch reform of business rates, and that's what the high street businesses have been calling out for sort of 20 years, really. So I do think there is a need for further reform of the system, and you asked particularly around the business rate system where support could be provided. There are three key elements that are included within the wider package of reforms that are in the consultation paper that was published at the budget. The first one, we often get penalised in the hospitality sector for investing in our premises, and that delivers higher turnover and then you get taxed. So it's a tax on success, and it happens frequently. And the suggestion is that there could be a longer period of time after a significant investment is made before the valuation office can come back and do a revaluation to be able to look at taking an additional chunk in business rates. That would be incredibly welcome. We would suggest that that is at least as long as the first revaluation period post an investment being made, so you don't get that significant change. The second one is talking around the interrelation between business rates and other tax factors for investment in the premises, because again about this penalisation. At the moment that's around capital allowances, but capital allowances don't extend to leased property, and about only around a third of the products that are invested in upgrading a pub or a hotel would be capable of being covered by capital allowance. And as Steve has quite eloquently said, you only pay corporation tax when you make a profit, and if you're not making a profit, then capital allowances don't really help you. So we do need to look at other ways. Maybe it's R&D tax credits, maybe it's discounts off the business rates for investment in green technology, for example, but things that help to incentivise rather than penalise people for making an investment in their premises. And then the third one isn't in the scope of the consultation, but is one that I think does need to be taken forward. There's a very delicate balance between rent and rates, and they are supposed to be self-correcting. In our sector, they're not, because those rental periods and the lease periods are long, and you have upward-only rent review clauses in most high street and city centre premises. And that means that your rents bill and rates bill cannot reset itself when you have changes in the market in the same way that you do with retail in the high street. And so, looking at taking forward, there was an outstanding consultation on commercial leases, which looked at a ban on upward-only rent review clauses. That would be significantly helpful for the department to take forward separately as part of a high street strategy.
Thank you.
Minister Jim McMahon.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for giving evidence, but also for the insight that you provided, which I thought was very comprehensive and gave a good insight into the industry. When and we all accept just how important pubs are, not just to the economy but to our communities. In many places they are a place where communities come together, where families meet, where memories are made, and I would say in many working class communities they're also buildings of note, of interest,
yes,
that add character, and so all that is taken, and for the work that your members do, it is appreciated. And what the government is trying to do is to give certainty in the system, to say it's not good enough that year on year you don't know what's coming down the line. We want you to be able to plan ahead. We want you to know the government will stand with you. There will always be limitations in any government action as to just how far it can go, but we believe that this is a comprehensive package that gets the right balance between the online retailers from the large distribution warehouses and the on-street and in community. But just in terms of the warning that has been issued, quite starkly I would say, of the warning for potentially 15,000 closures, how would that compare to the last, say, 10 years, so that we can put it into context of the number of pubs that have closed in that period?
It'd be a huge acceleration. So if you look at, the smoking ban was probably a huge intervention that drove habits and changed. I think in essence our operators would accept now it was a silver lining in a sense, because they had to modernise and make those pubs far more open and accessible to all. But this is a magnitude of failure in terms of acceleration. We're currently losing about 50 a month, and you've seen that through the state of figures and the insolvency numbers as well, and you're still seeing that, and you'll see that in your local communities. So it's a significant acceleration clearly of that rate, if you annualise that rate, and it will be a cliff edge, because it's the certainty. At the moment they have certainty that, I'll give you an example, and Kate's absolutely spot on, penalising success. We have a great operator running a brilliant bar in the centre of Manchester. He's tripled his turnover in the last few years, from 350,000 to 1 million. He employs 30 people, a lot of part-time, a lot of students in there as well. And he's seen that as business rates rise, in line with that. It hasn't given him that breathing space. And actually, he makes currently about 60k to the bottom line on a £1 million turnover business. What's been announced in the budget change will wipe all of that out. And you come to a decision about, is this the right thing to be doing now? As you've absolutely articulated, a lot of our operators do it because of a social purpose. They want to be in their communities, they want to be adding that additional value. It's not an overt commercial play for them. If it was, the head over heart decision would have driven some of them out already. But they just need that certainty and a little bit of hope that, as you said, and that's why we are, encouraged by the direction of travel. Seeing those two multipliers specifically for hospitality is fantastic. I would encourage the maximum that is in that bill to be applied, the maximum, because contextually right now it's going to be needed. We have got a re-evaluation coming up. I think, as Kate has intimated, that probably will not reflect the reality of rents, because it doesn't take into account what happened at the budget and how that actually drives the market and the impact that will have pretty rapidly. So by the time the re-evaluation comes around, it won't reflect that. So there is a consideration about the actual underlying multiplier of which that 20p is applied from being dropped as well, and that being kept under continuous review. But I agree entirely, we don't want to penalise these operators who are investing money but heart and soul into these businesses, and they want to do lots of things, and they can do it very quickly. One of our platforms is a Sustainability Champion Award, which we award, and we write to all of you guys. Hopefully you'll have some letters from our organisation applauding the efforts of operators within your localities. And they do amazing things rapidly, but some of that is now capital restricted, because they want to go fully electric kitchens, they want to go self-generation systems, they want recharging points in their car parks. Some have made that leap, but they are the outliers again who can afford to do it. And access to capital is a huge issue in our marketplace. You cannot get it as a mid-tier operator right now. Banks are just saying no. And if you look at the P&L, you can understand maybe why they are saying that, but it just creates a negative corkscrew. So this is key. We see it in a really positive way, but I implore the whole committee to apply the maximum on those two lower thresholds and keep that overriding multiplier firmly in your sights and make sure it goes down. We want to actually reduce the tax our pubs pay. Not because it's going to go into their bank accounts, it's because it will unlock investment and surety. And the tenure of our pubs, and publicans have been there 10, 20 years, they want to commit long term to these ventures. It's not a short term money making exercise. It's far more purposeful than that.
Can I just answer your question about the number of closures most recently? Clearly, over recent years, the last year we had 3,000 closures in total across hospitality as a whole. But since COVID, you've seen a reduction in about 20% in your neighbourhood independent restaurants, 30% in your neighbourhood independent nightclubs and late night music venues. So it's not just a pub issue where you're going to see closures. It is hitting across the board, and it also has hit a large number of guest houses, bed and breakfast and independent hotels. But one of the things that drives that is the investment in openings as well. You will always get a small number of closures that happen each year. Unfortunately, it's a devastating human tragedy for those involved, but you do get business failures. What drives the numbers is the lack of new openings and the investment coming through to reopen premises and to get businesses moving again. Business rates is a significant factor in that. The number of times that I have discussions with people about investment into the sector, whether that's FDI, whether that's major PE, or whether that's small-scale bank investment, Corporation tax never comes up. Business rates is always an inhibiting factor around investment. So this is really significant. I'd echo Steve's points as well about the importance of using the maximum for those two rates, the standard rate and a lower rate. There's often a misunderstanding or a misapprehension that the lower rate is small business and the standard rate is large. It's not. We have many independent single-site businesses that will be in that upper rate, and so applying the 20p discount to both really important. It's about 30% of hospitality businesses that pay business rates that are in that standard multiplier tier, and they account for 60% of employment and 60% of turnover. So really huge. The other point I would just say is that let's not kid ourselves either. There is an impact on that super rate that's charged for 500,000 plus. There's a small number of hospitality venues, but a significant number of them that are caught within that multiplier, and I'm not sure that that was always intended, given that, as you rightly say, Minister, that was designed to capture the online businesses. So if we could look again at some of those higher rates as we go through, the bill does give scope for different businesses to be treated differently in that 500 plus. We would urge you to make use of that, as well as the maximum 20p discounts below.
And there are some uniquenesses, if you like, in this particular part of the sector where turnover is so closely aligned to rateable value in a way that is unique to other parts of the system, which we do accept. I mean, how much of this in the end, and you'll know from members, but I hear it all the time as a constituency MP. We have a large family brewery, JW Lee's, who operate very heavily in our constituency, who are very good. Well, the margins are tight. And just how much of this is a number of factors, many of which are outside of government control, not least of all, rent. We heard earlier on from the IFS, who gave evidence that indicated that there is a market adjustment, that on one side there may well be a rate increase or decrease, but on the other side the rent will move accordingly.
Yes.
It's probably not really seen here, and it's outside the scope of the bill I accept, but it'd be helpful to get an insight as to what your assessment is of the marketplace and the rent levels that are applied to these businesses, and just how much that's really impacting on viability well beyond business rates.
We do an annual benchmarking survey in our sector across hospitality as a whole. We've done it over 15 years, and we look at the common site operating costs. Business rates has gone in the last 15 years from being around 4 to 5% of turnover across hospitality as a whole towards 7 to 8%. So it is creeping up. It's important, even though it's a relatively small cost, and by far and away the biggest cost we've got is labour. Our labour costs are the engine of our business. So it is creeping up, but the issue is that business rates is a fixed cost. You've got to be able to cover it before you can open your doors, and if you're not a going concern. Rent, it depends on different parts of the sector. On average, across the sector as a whole, it'll be around 11% of turnover. But it's lower than that if you're in the leased and tenanted pub estate. Largely that will be part of the regulated estate that is covered by the pubs code. There you have a ban on upward only rent reviews, and therefore you can get that adjustment that we were talking about. In the rest of the sector where you've got long leases because you need to be able to get the refit costs, you don't. And so while rents may change in the market, it's only one way once you're in. So that would be the area I think needs to be looked at as part of the review of commercial leasing that is ongoing with the department and the high street strategy.
And then if I can just a very quick supplementary to say your assessment of the number of your members that will benefit from the measures being taken.
From the measures being taken, the overwhelming majority of my members will benefit from those if it's taken to the maximum. But I would say in the current circumstances, I'd reiterate exactly what Steve said. It needs to be that 20%. It can't be, or 20p, sorry. It can't be up to. It needs to be for both of those. There is a proportion, there's about 700 hospitality businesses across the UK that fall into that super rate. And while that might sound like a very small number, it's a large proportion when it comes to employment, and it will be it's about 7% of employment that those businesses account for. They'll be particularly impactful because it will tend to be larger hotels and larger pubs and bars and restaurants, either in city centres, around 400 of those are in London, but also in areas, the coastal communities where we've got our large hotels. There will be very large premises. You asked earlier as well about margins. Over the course of the period since COVID, margins in the sector have eroded by 40%. Many of our businesses are now operating at a net profit margin of between 4 and 6%. And if you take those big hotels in Cornwall, in Devon, in quite deprived coastal areas, they will be the biggest employers by far. 20% of our employment in those coastal areas will be in the hospitality and tourism sector. So if we hit those businesses and apply a super rate at 500,000 plus, that will have a material impact on them, particularly when combined with the NIC increase. The final point on that 700, we're going through the revaluation period process at the moment. We estimate that there are a further 300 that are in the band of 400 to 500,000 rateable value currently. Given that the revaluation is looking at 100 to 200% increases in their rateable value as COVID support falls away, you could bring a further 300 businesses premises into that super rate. So we would urge at the moment that can be different rates above 500,000 for different types of premises as we read the bill. We would urge you to keep that as potentially a zero for those hospitality businesses if you choose not to exempt them totally. There's two options. You can exempt them from the face of the bill, or you can apply a zero rate so they just pay the standard rate. But that would further exacerbate closures across those big hospitality businesses in city centres and in coastal tourism communities.
And from a pub's perspective, the majority it will affect. We do have a small number that are obviously subject to the small business rates relief, and we're keen obviously for that to very much stay in place because they are those small essential community pubs as well. So it will have a material impact. But I'd ask the committee also to look at the real impact numbers that this is going to generate, because this comes down to our objective to try and get fairer taxation and a reduction in what they pay. So the maximum application of the 20p is key, as I said, but also looking at the multiplier definitely alongside the re-evaluation, because if that rises, which is highly likely, we need to think about the overall impact to ultimately what that bill will be, because we have a profitability issue right now. And come back to your comment, Minister, rates are part of an unfair tax burden that we just need to, again, equalise, with
that
digital.
That wasn't my point. I didn't use those words.
but this is a key part, and having that surety, and it has been impactful on business rates. Uncertainty, it's stopped small operators taking another site, and if they took another site, you're talking £300,000 to £400,000 worth of capital investment to build a new team of 40 employees. It has, and then the compound impact it has on the supply chain locally as well. So a lot of people have held a station that have potentially the ability to do it, but it's just not viable with the business rates bill as it is now. So you could unlock some significant investment and growth, and as we've shown previously, rapidly.
Quick supplementary from David Simmons on that point.
Thank you. The point about the impact of the multiplier and the discretion around it. Now, one of the things which we're all very well aware is local authorities in particular are very big customers of hotels in search of temporary accommodation, particularly, especially significant this time of year. So there often will be a strong incentive to make sure that there is a sustainable hotel sector in a given location to provide for that emergency housing need, as well as other wider purposes such as supporting tourism. Is it your view that there should be a discretion on the part of the billing authority so that if, for example, they need a sustainable hotel sector in order to meet temporary emergency housing need, or, for example, to accommodate significant numbers of refugees arriving pending onward placement elsewhere, that they should be able to negotiate rather than see those businesses go to the wall because of a lack of profit margin, only to then have to bill the taxpayer significantly more to place those people in accommodation at higher cost elsewhere?
Can I just say that the overwhelming majority of hotels are used for visitors for leisure and business purposes. Our hotel sector is a vital component of our tourism industry and also is our second largest service export earner in the form of tourism. So just to put it into context, as I understand it, there is discretionary relief. There are discretionary powers to local authorities to apply additional relief to those premises, not to change the multiplier. The multiplier is set nationally, and I think it would be important that that was retained so that there was a national multiplier. You get distortions if you've got different rates of doing that. But there's discretion if they want to be able to support a particular business, if it's impacted by flooding, for example, or if they want to maintain the provision of a service, they can apply additional discretionary relief over and above the nationally mandated relief. That obviously comes out of their own funding, and that is a better way of being able to do that, I would suggest, than changing the multiplier. There is a question about should local authorities retain an element of the business rates to be able to have this discretion to fund, but that's a bigger discussion than is the scope within this bill.
Thank you.
For the Lib Dems.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and apologies for being late. Got caught in traffic behind a tractor, I don't know why. Thank you for your evidence. As a Devon MP, a coastal Devon MP, Dawlish and Teignmouth are within my constituency. We have some major holiday sites in that area, which I'm fairly sure will fall into the upper brackets. Can I ask what your feeling is on the changing situation that we have? As I understand it, we have the 75% reduction right now. We're going to the 40% reduction, then we're going to the multiplier system. Will that be causing problems to be changing and chopping and changing every year?
I think the line of sight and the longer change going forward is really helpful to have set out. At this budget, the rates we understand will have to be set when you know what the multiplier is going forward. If the maximum 20p discount from the current multipliers, if the multiplier stays the same or could actually reduce, but if you had the maximum 20p, that's broadly equivalent to 40%. So you don't necessarily have that cliff edge, but it remains to be seen what happens when we come at the end of 2025-26 towards 26-27 in this longer term. But it could look as though it's broadly the same. The point about the 40% now, any relief is better than nothing at this point in time. We were facing a major cliff edge. But let's be in no doubt, for those businesses that are eligible for relief, and given there was a cap, it is the smaller businesses. They are facing a significant increase in their business rates bills from April. For the sector as a whole, it's an extra £0.5 billion of tax. If you look at the budget measures as a whole, it was £3.4 billion. That we're facing as a sector. So it's the cumulative impact. It's the reduction in relief and an increase in bills. And on top of everything else, they will have a big chunk of money to pay out additionally going forward. But 40% is better than nothing. As Steve said, it's less than 75%. The one thing I would say is that when Wales did reduce it to 40% last year, we saw a third. Closures in Wales were a third higher than they were in England. Scotland reduced it to 0, and failures in Scotland were significantly higher in the hospitality sector as a result when that was done. So it does have real-world impacts. And you can't take it away from the overall context of the tax situation that we're facing as a result of the budget in April, and it's the combined effect of all of that happening at the same time. But it should smooth out after that, and the longer term certainty and the fact that crucially the new multipliers apply to each and every premises. There is no state aid threshold, there is no cap. Previously that's been limited, and if the effects of the relief were effectively limited to premises that had businesses that had 2 or 3 sites. So multi-site businesses and those that had larger premises will now benefit going forward. So the industry as a whole will be on a much more sustainable footing longer term.
Thank you.
Can you introduce yourself for the record?
My name's Sacha Lord. I'm the nighttime economy advisor for Greater Manchester. Apologies, it's a combination of Vanty West and Farmers. That's why I'm late.
You can hear it from here.
Yes.
Quite rapidly. Okay, so the first backbencher who caught my eye was Polly Billington.
Thank you very much, Chair. Steve, I'd just like to ask a couple of questions in relation to what you were talking about in terms of the threats to the pub industry generally. I represent East Thanet, which is made up of Ramsgate, Broadstairs and Margate, very much what you were talking about in terms of reliant heavily on the leisure, hospitality and tourism industries, and with a lot of much-loved pubs in our town centres. I am also aware that some of those pubs have closed over the last couple of decades. What would you identify as the drivers of the closures up until now of those pubs? And what are the numbers, just to get a context within which we're talking about what might be the risks that you've identified about these measures?
I think a number of factors. I think we've seen a real evolution of the pub model, and I think inevitably in any market, those that don't evolve and keep that connection with their customers and that relevancy, unfortunately, they do fall by the wayside. There's natural evolution within the industry, but the cost base has fundamentally changed. The P&L has changed for running pubs. It's a tight margin business, tighter than it's ever been. The two outliers of our model are property and people. We need a place to operate, obviously in the very communities we serve, and we need lots and lots of people. And both of those obviously have been subject to cost increases during that period as well. So yes, consumer tastes have changed. We know that, but we have some fabulous pubs who've completely embraced that. And are full every day of the week because they're creating events. In fact, we have a major platform with our Licensee of the Year award, which we do every year, and we have a very proud winner who runs a high street pub in Burnley. And every day of the week, and this is a grassroots, wet-led pub in the community, there's a reason for people to go, and she has a real cross-section of the community, and would consider that she's got 150 locals she knows by name, the family background, and they go in to connect in the community. That is their hub.
But forgive me, can I just follow up on this? I'm really impressed by the resilience of the pub industry in the context of those external drivers. But what might be legislative or tax or regulatory changes over the previous decades that might have contributed to that crisis in the pub industry? I just want to understand the context within which we're operating.
So employment, obviously, costs, as we know, have been rising disproportionately, and obviously the employer costs of doing so. The legislation around that, obviously, we're subject to not only licensing, but a number of other compound issues that we have to deal with locally, with lots of different local stakeholders, which all of these need to be implemented with costs as well. So it's really the complexity and the accountability, the safeguarding, all of those elements add layers of cost and complexity to the business. So it's no longer what it was 20 years ago, which is a far simpler model to execute, and the cost base has fundamentally changed. But tax, during that period, the tax has risen. Look at VAT as a start point, and you have to control pricing with your cost base. We can't just pass through compound inflation running at 20% a year. There's a dynamic issue at play, which is trade will fall off a cliff. We've seen it, very deliberately in certain kind of high streets where, they've just pushed that pricing too far, and consumers who've been subject to their own challenges have fallen away. So they've held that back to make it affordable, which in itself has eroded the margin and ultimately the profitability. So I think it's a compound of all those things in play, and it's a tough business. Running a modern pub, you are full in. It's a 7-day-a-week business. These guys are not taking minimum wage right now for themselves. So about protecting workers, they are workers in their own pubs, and they're not getting the rewards that they absolutely deserve for the efforts, but they're willing to invest and look forward, but they need certainty. That's why this bill is an integral part of a set of measures that need to provide that certainty. So we don't lose fabulous publicans, licensees and families who know their communities so well, and you know them in East Thanet. There's some fabulous pubs there.
Thank you.
Any other witnesses on this one?
I would just add, over the last 5-6 years, you can't escape the fact that you've had closures, or you've not business closures, but closures due to COVID. And COVID-related debt. So over the last 5 to 6 years, that has been the backdrop against which these businesses are trying to recover. So you've not really had a break from COVID to be able to build back resilience into the businesses. It's not just pubs; it's also, as I say, the broader hospitality sector is also facing those same challenges. Because you've had high levels of COVID debt that was government issued to be able to remain afloat during that period. You had 2 years where you were operating at or below break even, and 1 in 3 of our businesses have no cash reserves because they haven't had the ability to rebuild those cash reserves. So the resilience in the independent sector in particular is just lacking. If you then couple it on to over the last 6 to 7 years, the tax burden that they've borne, pre-profit taxes in particular in our sector, that has increased significantly over that period in time, and that further erodes the margin. So if you were going into COVID in 2019, the tax burden overall was 32% of turnover. It's now 38% of turnover coming out of that. And if you do it as a percentage of profit, it's 77% of our profits go back in one form of taxation, funding vital public services. But we are the highest taxed sector of the economy overall as a percentage of profit. Nobody else pays as much tax as we do, and that you can't get away from that when you're looking at it. Added to that are factors that are outside anybody's control that have driven closures over the last 6 to 7 years. Energy, 400% increases in energy bills on the back of the war in Ukraine. 20% food price inflation, again, on the back of the war in Ukraine, where you've got tariffs that come through. Those are significant additional costs that you're bearing in the business that go through to erode the margin. And at the same time, a cost of living crisis, which means that you can't pass that on to your customers. So you're caught between a rock and a hard place as an operator. And for the bigger operators, they just cut their investment fully. So that's £7 billion not going into investment in our high streets this year in order to be able to cope with those cost pressures that are coming through. The businesses will remain afloat. The independents don't have that cushion to be able to manage it. And so they run out of road in essence.
And just build on one illustration, small pubs are still handling that COVID debt, and it can be up to £1,000 a month. These guys are paying to still pay that off, of which obviously the government debt is a core part. And when you are unprofitable and you're still paying that out, you can imagine the quandary and why we're going to hit a tipping point pretty quickly. And that will be lost, not only just the taxation they generate, but repaying that outstanding debt as well.
Apologies if this has been said before I arrived, but my concern is a pub is not just a place that serves a pint. The pub is the heart of the communities, and we know that 64% of people that said the pub was one of the main places they actually congregated to, and 86% said that when a pub closes, the community suffers. We are anticipating up to 9,000 closures next year, with the double whammy in April with the NAI increase and the business rates increase. And I'm actually more concerned about closures in Q1 next year than I was during COVID.
Thanks. Next person I saw was Harriet Cross.
Thank you all for coming. And I aimed my question originally at Mr. Alton, but then probably one that everyone could have a go at. You mentioned 15,000 potential closures, and I know Mr. Lord just said 9 in Q1 next year. But and then a figure of about, was it 15 on average employees per pub? So that brings it up to about 250,000 potential job losses. And of course, that's going to be across the board. It's not full-time jobs, it's part-time, sort of holiday jobs, starter jobs, yep. A huge impact. Has the sector, or have you modelled where those are likely to fall, when they're likely to come, how they might be mitigated, and what ultimately can be done to either prevent that or to help them move into other sectors across hospitality?
So some of that is already happening. So some people are already, kind of trimming their staff numbers down anyway, trying to get ahead of this. In a sense, they've got some degree of resilience. The real frustration is the reverse of what you just said. We pride ourselves on being the place to take people in who, we have some amazing charities in our sector who bring people out who are facing homelessness, and we placed over 600 of those individuals into hospitality and put our arms around them and given them a platform, and they've already progressed to phenomenal levels of achievement within our sector. So that's what's at risk. But equally, the part-timers are the ones that are under scrutiny right now because they're triggering a premium payment for the employer. And some of those individuals absolutely depend on that, that fixed hours role, because the only thing they can fit in versus their demands, be it childcare or others. So it's heartbreaking to see some of those individuals already starting to lose hours and then ultimately jobs. So it will come in a wave, but that's not just that's just direct employment. Think about the supply chain as well. So I'd ask it within consideration when you're looking at multiples and the real impact, is that foundational economic place that pubs kind of prop up. Where are all the tendrils that go out into the community, all those connected jobs from the butchers to the cleaners to the window cleaners and everything in between that is sometimes hidden. So every job that's going to be lost in a pub is connected to multiple jobs in that community that are dependent on the demand that that pub drives. So yeah, it's deeply frustrating, as we know that the government is passionately wanting to get people back into work. We are the answer to that, but right now, unfortunately, we're limiting the potential of our sector to really help with that issue.
Thank you.
I just want to say, when you look at job losses in our sector, it is very difficult to be able to strip out and identify the difference between the business rates changes that we're talking about here versus changes in NI. And Steve's absolutely right. You know, you've got, for somebody who's on minimum wage or just above at 20 hours a week, the effective increase in their tax, the employer's tax, is 75% on those jobs. So that is where you are going to see hours cut, jobs reduced as a result of that change, but you can't dissociate the two. That's why it's very difficult to be able to model and answer your question specifically about where are you going to see business failures versus job losses as we go through, because clearly...
Can I just say, maybe what the Minister was about to say, we've got only 5 minutes for 2 more people that I've seen, and this is a little bit steering out of scope of the specific contents of this bill.
Well, it was that point when I'd say it's almost the opposite, really, which is, given the context that's been outlined, this is the respite that the industry has been calling for. So I think if we can keep to the scope of the bill and the measures it provides, it would be helpful.
Okay, I've still got 2 more people I've seen indicating, and I said that I'm going to do the knife at 5 past, didn't I? So Jane Kirkham.
Just quite a quick one, and I'm glad you're here too, Mr. Lord, because we were talking about the super tax, the 500 limit. I'm from Cornwall, so I completely understand what you're saying about those large hotels. And also, I was going to ask your opinion about other leisure, so kind of the theme parks and the other things, the nighttime economy, the music venues, the theatres. Could you give me an idea if they will be impacted by this change, by this super rate?
Nightclubs will certainly be impacted. If you think about a nightclub versus a pub, obviously it's a much larger space, so they are going to suffer sadly under this.
So a kind of a percentage figure, I suppose, how many across the board, considering theatres, theme parks, everything, and hospitality? Because I think you said 7%, didn't you? It's fairly low. But
yes, if you look at hospitality venues, which would include nightclubs and would include the larger hotels, but wouldn't include theme parks necessarily, but it would include sort of campsites, holiday parks, those areas. You're looking at around 700 premises. So of those that pay business rates, that is around 1% of total businesses. But it's 7% of employment, and it's closer to 11% of turnover. So they are quite big. They are quite a disproportionate proportion of our tourist infrastructure in terms of employment, and in certain locations they will be up to 20% of local employment. So it is quite significant. My understanding of the bill is that this could provide respite for them, because there is an opportunity to apply different rates of a super rate or a super charge, however you want to phrase it, for different types of businesses. So we can differentiate on business use above that 500,000 threshold. We would urge the government to do that, and we'll be working with them as this bill goes forward and as the consultation goes forward to make sure that they take advantage of that. So you don't treat a large distribution centre, fulfilment centre, the same as a hotel.
Thank you.
Or nightclub.
Adam Dodson.
Chair, I didn't indicate that.
In that case, Serena.
Briefly. My constituency is Wolverhampton North East. So in terms of the constituency, I haven't got the city centre in the constituency, but what we have got is lots of cafes, brilliant restaurants, microbreweries, and also pub chains. So what, in terms of the scope of this bill, what benefits will there be for those small businesses?
For those small businesses in suburban locations and neighbourhood and community locations like your constituency, this bill and the specific scope of this bill, if the deduction is applied to the maximum, we'll see a significant reduction in the bills for all of those premises, that are hospitality, not just those that are subject to a cap and getting up to 100,000. So every single business in your constituency at a hospitality sector below 500,000, and forgive me, I didn't do this double check, but I don't think you have any, would benefit from a reduction in their business rates bills permanently going forward, and that would help to redress the balance of their overall tax burden.
I'd say this is a substantial lifeline for all those businesses. It really is. My concern is between April and when this comes into force.
I guess we finished ahead of time, haven't we? No. One more. Sorry, Mark Simmons. Yeah.
Very brief, Doctor.
You've got a few seconds.
Yes, my question is to Kate Nicholls. It's a really brief one. In the context of this bill, you mentioned earlier, and I'm paraphrasing here, business rates always come up as a barrier to extra investment. Please, can you talk more about that?
So I chaired for the Mayor of London a tourism recovery task force that he had to get London tourism going, and as part of that we look at FDI and we look at real estate coming in, and also more broadly, clearly the top 20 restaurant, pub, hotel chains are all private equity backed. Most of it is FDI. Business rates always comes up. Every single time you talk about inward investment into the UK in property-based businesses as to whether they should come here or they should go to mainland Europe or America, business rates is an inhibiting
I'm being
factor.
told I have to cut you off. Sorry about that. So that brings us to the end of the allotted time for that set of witnesses. So we'll do a changeover. I thank those witnesses for this panel, and we'll move on to the next one. So we now move on to oral evidence from the Independent Schools Bursars Association and the Independent Schools Council. We have until 3:30, and we are expecting votes as well, just to make it even more exciting.
3:40, sorry.
3:40? Okay, we have until 3:40. Okay, as you take your seats, could the witnesses please introduce themselves for the record? $3.40?
Yeah, 3:40 is correct, sorry.
Oh, that wasn't. Wait, it's three separate people.
If the vote comes through, just break and we can do.
If the vote happens, 15 minutes suspension and 10 minutes for every. It's four people. Okay, gentlemen, can you introduce yourselves to us, please?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Barnaby Lenon. I'm chairman of the Independent Schools Council, which represents 600,000 pupils, about 80% of independent school pupils in the United Kingdom. I also, it's worth knowing, set up a state school in East London, the London Academy of Excellence, and I'm currently a governor of 11 state schools in Birmingham.
Good afternoon, I'm David Woodgate. I am Chief Executive of the Independent Schools Bursars Association, which has 1,300 member schools, and we support those schools in all aspects of the business running of an independent school.
Yes, hi, good afternoon. My name's Simon Nathan. I'm the Deputy Chief Executive and Head of Policy at the Independent Schools Council.
And I'm Don Beattie. I'm a private practice chartered surveyor specialising in rating. I'm a technical advisor to the Independent Schools Bursars Association, and I'm here in case anything technical should arise.
Okay, we start again with Shadow Minister David Simmons.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Can I declare for the record I have a significant number of independent schools, nurseries and other institutions in my constituency, two of which my family are customers of. I'd like to ask the panel, because we do need to stick very much within the scope of what is in this legislation, that whilst the feedback I've had from the sector is that it's felt like a very difficult time indeed, being on the end of a targeted attack on your education sector. There are a number of proposals in particular around the nature of business rates and the way that they're applied, given that a lot of schools are not merely involved in education, but they will have things like nurseries and other ancillary facilities on site. Could you give us an indication of how your members both are impacted specifically by what is proposed in this bill, and whether you consider there are improvements that could be made to take account of the fact that, for example, in the case of nurseries, if they are a separate building on a separate site, they're not within scope, but if they are on the same site, then they are within scope?
So, Thank you. So today we're trying to make 2 points, really. One is that this bill is inadvertently creating a two-tier charity system, and we may come back to that. But the other point, which is, I think, your question, is the impact on our schools, but more particularly our pupils and parents, including faith schools. And David, you're probably best to answer this question on the finances.
The impact on finances is material. I accept we're talking about business rates here today, but we cannot do that in isolation of the other three financial shocks that are impacting on independent schools within the last 12 months. The first was the increase in the teachers' pension contributions from April last year, going from 23.6% to 28.68%. Secondly, in common with every other business, the national insurance increases and the lowering of the threshold has a material impact on our schools. 70% of the cost base of a typical independent school is staff costs. So clearly this will impact, and schools have just not had the time to prepare for that, to build that into their budgets and indeed into their fees for the remainder of the current academic year. We also have a 20% VAT rate from the 1st of January. Just 2 months in which to prepare for that. There was a reasonable expectation that that would not happen, at least until next September. So alongside those three financial factors, dare I say, business rate relief is the icing on the cake. It's the fourth leg of a quadruple whammy that will impact extremely negatively on our schools. They are considering closure. Probably the only lever a lot of our schools have got to face up to some of these challenges is redundancies. I have schools now that are looking at redundancies. Most teachers are on 1 term's notice, so it hasn't worked through yet. But over the course of the rest of this academic year, I think there is an inevitability that that will be the response of many of our schools that just cannot afford these 4 elements altogether. If I were to make a plea, it would be to give us some grace on the implementation of the business rate relief as a way of helping schools get through an unprecedented number of financial shocks. And if it could at least be deferred until April 2026, or perhaps phased in 20% reduction over each year up to 5 years, that would be of tremendous assistance to schools labouring under a real financial burden that is not impacting on any other section of the economy. No other section of the economy has these 4 shocks simultaneously. Thank you.
Doctor, if I could ask a further question. It'd be helpful perhaps if one of the panel could return to the point about the hereditaments, as in the sites and the impact where you have multiple different types of service on a given site, where if those were separated out, they would not be subject and come within these business rate changes, particularly nursery care, but where they're co-located, the whole site is subject to that. If I may just ask you, one of the things we're going to be considering tomorrow is that I think most of us will probably have been contacted by constituents who've been displaced from the independent sector and who are unable to secure places in the state sector, is whether, in order to support state schools who are having to deal with that in-year impact, whereby they won't be funded through the normal autumn-winter pupil count because that's already taken place and therefore would have to wait a long time before seeing any additional funding, we could consider ring-fencing the proceeds locally, so at least it would go to mitigate some of the impact of that displacement at a local level. To be interested in whether you have a view about what mitigations by way of either local discretion, ring-fencing of the proceeds, or otherwise, we could put in place, in particular to help those families who've been pushed out of the independent sector but are unable to secure a funded state school place for their child at this point.
Well, I think there's a number of areas. One area, in terms of mitigations as a bill and trying to relieve pressure on the state sector, one area where we do have concerns, for example, is in the treatment of children with special educational needs. And I say at the outset, we wholly recognise the measures in the bill to exempt those schools with over 50% pupils on education, health and care plans. the independent sector as a whole educates 130,000 children with special educational needs. 100,000 do not have EHCPs, 30,000 do. Those pupils will be scattered across different schools in this sector. Often they'll be in smaller schools with small class sizes. Not all of those schools are going to get the protection from that EHCP threshold. And those will be schools who will either be faced with paying the business rates bill or parents seeing some of that passed on to their fees. We know that it is not the best time for there to be more SEND pupils going into the state sector. Just yesterday, the Institute for Fiscal Studies put out a report saying that high needs budgets are £3 billion in deficit. One of the mitigations that we would like to see is an expansion of the exemptions given to SEND pupils, perhaps exempting schools where 50% or over of pupils with SEN, not necessarily always on an EHCP, can also benefit from that type of exemption to try and mitigate the additional pressures going on local authority SEND.
If I might just add to what Simon's saying, currently the way that the provision is written is that the EHCP is the determinant for excluding the school from the definition of private schools. However, in Schedule 5 of the same Act, you'll find that there's an adequate definition for disability, which references the Equalities Act of 2010.
If I can just pursue that specific technical point. So, under the SEND system in the state sector, traditionally there was, as well as the statement, then the Education and Healthcare Plan, you had structures such as School Action and School Action Plus. So, a child who had needs identified, but that were not sufficient to trigger the issuing of an EHCP, but which did require additional resource, would get that provided through their state school. Do you feel there is a case for saying any child who might not have a statement, but who would have qualified for School Action or School Action Plus, should also fall within the scope of that exemption?
We recognise that clearly there has to be some sort of boundary, and obviously it wouldn't be possible to draw up an exemption based on a tax on property that exempted every pupil with SEN. This suggestion that we're making, as I said, is that schools where more than 50% of pupils get SEN support would benefit from that exemption. So that would bring in, we looked at the numbers, perhaps an extra 100 schools and an extra 4,500 pupils. But clearly, if you are a pupil in a school which is over 50% SEN, you are going to have a certain level of need, and perhaps those are not always needs that can be catered for in a mainstream school.
Thank you very much.
Minister for His Majesty's Government.
First of all, thank you for the evidence that you've given already, and thank you for making the time to come to this evidence session. It's our opportunity, I suppose, to get an insight into the nuances and how it feels on the ground. And although we kind of talk about private schools, we talk about the independent sector, the truth is that represents a very broad spread of different types of schools in terms of their makeup, their pupil numbers, their financial models, etc. And it would just be helpful to get a snapshot just about the variety of schools within the system more generally, and maybe just to compare and contrast. Probably a couple of different would be quite helpful to just get that picture, and then I'll follow up with a question short.
Yeah. Well, I'll kick off, and then maybe you could continue.
Touch on one.
Yeah. So we have a huge range of types of school. At one end, there are quite expensive boarding schools, and you know their fees are often quoted, but it's very expensive to run a boarding school. But they're not typical, because the average independent school is, in our sector, 280 pupils, so pretty small. So half are smaller than that. And I've been a governor of schools with 120 pupils, but the special needs schools we're talking about now often have 50 pupils. And there are plenty of faith schools, which Simon will talk about in a moment, which also have very, very small numbers and yet are quite important in their particular faith community. So, so fees The average fee for a day school is about 18,000, but half or less than that. And there are some with incredibly small fees, just a couple of thousand a year, that kind of thing, less than would normally be spent on a pupil in a state school. So there's a massive range in terms of fee and the size of school, and it's true to say that we are particularly concerned this afternoon about the low-cost schools, the small schools, because they're the ones who are most vulnerable. They're the ones who are already closing. They're the ones who have told us through the surveys which we've done that they are going to close if the situation continues as it is going to continue, as far as one can see. Do you want to say something about faith schools?
Yeah, that's it. I mean, Barney said there is a range. 1,000 schools, so 40% of schools in our sector have less than 100 pupils. So they're not always very big schools. I mean, if I just touch very briefly on faith schools, so there's 20,000 children who attend Muslim faith schools in our sector, and those schools charge an average of £3,000 per year in terms of fees. They are Orthodox Jewish Haredi schools who in our sector, so 65 schools who educate 20,000 children. Those schools ask for, on average, about £100 a week or less. And the way those schools are modelled, if a family comes and they can't afford it, the school would accept them anyway, and it's the community that steps in and fundraises to make up that financial difference. For those types of Orthodox Jewish schools, just to give you an example, I said they run on a low-fee model. Quite a lot of them are in London, where there's high property prices, and because Haredi Jewish families tend on average to have more children, a lot of those schools will have pupil numbers sort of 800 pupils, so they'll be in quite large buildings, and they can have quite large rates bills when this change comes into effect. I've spoken to representatives of those communities who are extremely concerned by the impact this is going to have. They say it's a low-fee model. They don't get huge amounts of money in fees, but the rates bill could be tens of thousands, if not more, in cost. The only way those schools can bridge that gap is through fundraising from the synagogues in the community. And if that money can't come forward, then those schools just don't have the money to pay the bill. So they're very concerned.
And just in terms of the variety of different schools and the specialisms, in particular those for special needs schools. Now, clearly, we have made provisions to ensure that those with more than 50% pupils in receipt of an EHCP are exempt from this, so they're out of scope. In the end, do you reflect that many parents maybe feel the need to go to the independent sector, the private sector, because they don't feel perhaps that the mainstream provision is adequate? And on that basis, is there a reflection back that the government's priority of rebuilding that mainstream provision and the significant money that's been invested, an additional £1 billion this year, is about essentially fixing a system so parents do have genuine choice and don't feel they have no other choice but to? The second point I would make is about the quantum and if it was followed through. So there will be an assumption that as a business, schools will look to absorb as much of the additional pressures as possible. I'll be honest, in the way that state schools have had to over the last decade. These are the choices that every business has to make to try and make the numbers work at the end of the day. But even if every pound was passed on by our assessment, it's just over £300 per pupil on these measures, £300 per pupil per year, which clearly is less than £1 a day. And so I think in context of the bill, and I understand you've given a wider context, but for the scope of the bill, what assessment has been made of the impact of that average just over £300 per pupil per year if it was passed on in its entirety on people potentially leaving the sector, and also on the headroom that schools might have to absorb it within existing budgets?
Should I, the first point on SEN, should I just take that?
You reckon SEN?
I think your first point was talking about SEN. And I think to say at the outset, we support increased investment in SEN in state schools. We support a well-funded state sector. The situation many parents find themselves in, you say at the moment, is that to kind of cater for the specific needs of their child, perhaps they find that that they have to go to an independent school to have that need met. And at the moment, that is the kind of choice that's open to them. And as I said, at the moment, we see our sector as providing that additional capacity to support state SEN services. And I said it's over 100,000 children. So our sector will be there to kind of pick up that need. And often those who come to independent schools are those with more complex needs. But we wholeheartedly support more investment in kind of state SEN. Yeah. David, do you want to touch on it?
I think the £308 per pupil translates into about £147,000 per school for the business rate relief alone. And I think our schools have been working very hard to manage their cost basis. Since COVID, a lot of our schools dropped their fees by up to 50%. They provided hardship funding, they educated, looked after children of key workers with no state support. And since then we have been rebuilding. But I think the sector acknowledges that it can't just keep putting this onto fees, because aspirational parents, who represent many of the parents who choose our education, two-income families with the second income going very much on providing independent education, you can't load the fees. So it is looking at the cost base. I think costs are being cut back to the bone, subjects being dropped, and inevitably this will result now in redundancies. I was speaking to a school just yesterday that said the impact of the NI and the business rate relief is over £500,000 a year. They will be making 8 teachers redundant over the course of the next 2 terms. That is indicative, I think, of what a lot of schools will have to do, which of course in turn impacts on the provision, on all of the other things that a school offers.
But I suppose what I was trying to get to more was almost the evidence is pushing it too far, but certainly the assessment that's been made of the impact, because I think language like parents are aspirational. Well, all parents are aspirational by and large, regardless of the school that their children go to. I'm aspirational. My son goes to a state school. That doesn't mean I'm a lesser parent. But I don't want the conversation to be about that. I want it to be about making sure that in the course of this bill and the assessment that we're trying to make about its impact, that we fully appreciate the impact. And a lot's been made about the displacement of pupils potentially from the private independent sector into the state sector. And it'd be just helpful to get your assessment of that. Our assessment says, based on May 23 data, there's around 1 million unfilled vacancies in primary and secondary schools in the state sector for capacity to receive children. Of that 1 million, how many do you expect could be potentially brought forward from the private sector as a result of this measure?
So we did a pupil number survey this September that asked schools what their pupils were in September 24 compared to September 2023. That showed pupil numbers were down already by 10,000. So if you translated that into the additional cost of the state sector, that will cost the state sector around £80 million to educate those 10,000 pupils. So,
it's important to say, though, that the million vacancies I referred to are vacancies in existing schools. So the teachers are in the classrooms, that the buildings are there. These are vacancies in the existing school system.
No, I appreciate that. I mean, the point I was making was just in terms of the money that would be raised to support greater investment in state education. Obviously, some of that will get eaten up by the pupils moving over. In terms of hotspots, it would depend very much in parts of the country. Obviously, our schools obviously predominantly in the south of England, there'll be certain parts of London in particular. While we fully appreciate that on a macro level there is a certain level of vacancy, I think our concern is that there'll be particular parts of the country where there kind of might be more hotspots.
Thank you.
Do we have a Lib Dem front bencher at all?
Yes.
Okay, in that case.
Thank you, Doctor.
Vicky Slade.
Thank you. So I'm conscious of trying to keep this onto this bill, because I'm worried that a lot of the comments you're making really are talking about the state of the independent sector more widely, and this is, as has been suggested, a relatively minor change, whilst I understand it's off the back of other things. So what thoughts have been given in terms of how the independent sector might mitigate what is effectively a property tax being changed by actually rationalising the amount of property that they use? There's an awful lot of independent schools have got an awful lot of land and property that perhaps they could mitigate this through that. Has any thought been given to how you rethink how you use property?
Before I ask David to answer that, can I just say there aren't a lot of independent schools that have a lot of property. There are a small number that definitely have a lot of property. But if you've visited as many independent schools as I have, a lot of them are in converted houses with no property other than that. They have many of our schools have far less property than a normal state primary school would have. But nevertheless, your point is taken. Do you want to comment on?
Can I just say, each one of the independent schools in my constituency, you could probably build a small village on their land, and so yes, I accept that there are some, but there are also schools that might be able to merge in order to fix that problem.
Yeah, I mean, it's not typical that a school will be carrying a lot of excess land. Although we have seen things like prep schools moving on to senior school sites and disposing of the prep, an obvious thing to do, and putting that money then into bursary funding or wherever. We are seeing mergers of schools, which might well result in one site being surplus to requirements, and that money again can be recycled into providing the educational product. So I don't think schools are blind to the fact that they may have some levers they can pull, but you can only sell off the family silver once. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily a longer term solution. It's what you do with that money, how you use it. But I think Barnaby's absolutely right. I've been to 4 prep schools in the last 2 weeks. They are just converted Victorian villas with no extra space. And, they're doing a very good job. There's not even anywhere to put a minibus. It's that tight.
Thank you.
We've got until 40 past. I've seen 6 people indicating. The first one was Nav Mishra.
Thank you, Chair. I'm grateful to the panellists for being here and giving up their time. Private schools have had visibility of the Labour Party policy on this matter for a very long time, and I'm just wondering why the sector seems to be so unprepared in light of the new government coming in and delivering on its manifesto pledge to these changes.
Well, personally, I don't think they are particularly unprepared. I mean, as you say, we have had plenty of notice.
They seem surprised. They seem very surprised.
Well, they shouldn't be surprised, because the Independent Schools Council and at the Independent Schools Bursars Association, the 3 of us have been talking to schools for the past year and a bit. Schools have been receiving advice about how to prepare for this, from David's organisation particularly. So I don't think it's true to say that they've been taken by surprise, but I think it's worth just saying that these are charities, mostly small charities. They're operating on tight margins. They are not extravagant in the way they operate themselves, and they have found it difficult to know how to face particularly 20% VAT. But they've had plenty of notice, and the governing bodies of those schools are individually responsible, of course, for taking the actions that the sensible ones will be taking.
Thank you, Mr. Lenon. I take your point that you feel that they felt...
We've got until... How long have we got? 8 minutes for 6 people.
Do you think they're prepared?
I think 1 question each between that order. Harriet Cross, 1 question each.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Because there's 4 people to reply to each one.
Thank you. Mine's very brief, and actually fits on quite well into what Mr. Lenon just said about margins being tight. And is there an average figure for the average margin that one of your schools sort of would expect, and how might that change with I guess within the scope of the bill, the changes to the business rates relief?
The benchmark is 10% net surplus on gross fees. We have many schools that are dropping down to 5% to break even and now going into deficit in order to meet the quadruple whammy, if I can put it that way.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No one else? Okay, in that case, I saw next Michelle Welsh.
Yes, just really, really quick. I just want to go back to something I think that you said, Simon, with regards to special educational needs in independent schools, and that in some cases SEN can only be met by the independent schools. Can you give some further clarification on that? Because I spent a long time working in special educational needs in the state sector at every single key stage in specialised special schools and in mainstream state schools, and there wasn't a single case that I didn't see was able to dealt with in a state school in some way or another. With the further investment that we're talking about in this government, I think that will change back again. So I'd just like some further clarity on that, because if there are cases like that, then that should be taken up with the local authorities and the members of Parliament, because that should not be the case.
I mean, I'm more than happy to follow up with the committee on that, because obviously I don't have a specific cases written in front of me, but I can obviously go and find that information. I don't think it's a kind of issue on the national scale, but I think there will be particular local areas where in that locality the independent school is filling a need that perhaps can't be wholly fulfilled. I'm not saying that the expertise isn't there in the state sector. I'm saying sometimes that the capacity might not always be there.
Holly Billington.
Thank you very much, Chair. I noticed that the Independent Schools Council's schools, the private schools in that body, have the fees have doubled in cash terms in the last 20 years. I'd be interested for those that rise to be explained in some way, the causes behind it, and also the impact, both on numbers and the composition of the pupils attending the schools.
Well, I'll speak first. So I've been on a number of governing bodies, and indeed have been a head teacher of schools where that happened, where the fees went up quite significantly. And it was particularly in the period sort of 2003 to 8, that kind of period, when the fees were driven by increases in state school teachers' pay, by increases in national insurance and increases in pension contributions. It wasn't anything to do with suddenly we all wanted to build new buildings. It was more or less forced upon us, but they were quite big increases, you're right. And the impact of that has been that fewer parents have been able to afford our schools.
By how much?
Well, I can't give you an answer to that. We don't know. But I'm quite confident there'll be plenty of parents who will have found it too difficult. Yeah.
Well, I mean, just to give the numbers, if you looked at the numbers of pupils in independent schools over the last 10 years from the DFE data, on the face of it, you could say, well, there's 12,000 more, but that's during a period where the overall school population went up by 800,000. So the proportion of pupils educated in independent schools went down from 7% to 6.5%. There's been a proportionate decrease. Yeah.
4 minutes and 3 people left. Deirdre Cossey.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for your evidence today. I formerly was a chair of a governing body of a state school myself, so this is a really interesting conversation. And I noticed, Mr. Woodgate, you mentioned that private schools rather might need to look at redundancies to absorb the impact of this. And I just wondered, I understand that there's double, I think, the kind of teacher-student ratio in state schools than there is in private schools. So I think it's something like 8.5 to 1 versus 18 to 1 in state schools. So there is, significantly more teaching staff in private schools. Have you done any assessment of if there was to be, if there was
this
have you done any assessment of whether that would be similar to the impact that we've seen on state schools?
Pupil-teacher ratios, I think, are increasing anyway. That many schools are much beyond that. That is not a typical pupil-teacher ratio in one of our schools. Many are going up towards 20, the same kind of number that you're talking about in the state sector. But inevitably, if there are redundancies, there will be less teachers to go around and they will be teaching more pupils.
Sorry, Chair, I was just specifically asking, compared to the state sector, do you think there will be a similar impact or a worse impact? Or
quite possibly.
Which one?
Similar or worse?
or do you think less of an impact? Do you think it'll have less of an impact than under the redundancy?
No, I think inevitably if pupil teacher numbers change, that will be a negative impact.
Let's try and get into multiple marks, Seawards.
Thank you, Doctor. Two questions very briefly. First to Mr. Woodgate. I understand the Minister wanted to move on from this, but your comments about aspirational parents, the simple fact is that all state school parents are aspirational too.
I understand.
And they'll never be in a financial position to send their kids to private school in many cases. So I just wanted to give you an opportunity to clarify that. And secondly, given that over 1,000 private schools closed between 2010 and 2024 without much media attention, how many private schools do you estimate will close as a result of this bill?
Picking up your second point, we are estimating that somewhere between 200 and 250 of our 1,300 schools are vulnerable to closure. They may look at mergers, they may look at other options, some might academise, for instance, but that's the kind of figure that we are looking at. I take your point about aspirational parents, and what we've got to ensure is this does not impact on the bursary funding that is available for people from more disadvantaged backgrounds to get a place at one of our schools if they so wish to do it. And we've got to make sure as far as possible that with these threats to our income, the funds available for bursaries are maintained.
Serena Breckenridge.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the panel for coming and sharing your views and experiences. Once again, within the scope of this bill, in terms of business rate relief, I was a former deputy head teacher working across state secondary schools. Private schools, I say, are businesses. I had to juggle reduced and constraints across the budgets. Departments like science departments struggling to ensure that children have a full hands-on experience.
Have to.
Okay.
Okay, we're now moving on to our 9th panel of witnesses, so thank you, gentlemen. Those seats will be vacated by you and new people. Rachel Kelly, Assistant Director of Tax and Finance Policy at the British Property Association. This is a one-man panel, is it?
Yeah.
Until 3:50.
Till 4.
Oh,
sorry,
it,
4 p.m. 4 p.m.
Oh, what?
I should say 4 p.m.
Okay, until 4 p.m. All this is completely wrong, what I'm looking at. Shadow Minister David Simmons.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Huck. Clearly, the bill has a wide-ranging impact across all different types of property. But I wonder if I could ask the next witness. Could you just give us a sense from respect to the British Property Federation, which I understand is largely dealing in sort of the transactions that sit behind property, if you could tell us a bit about what you perceive as the impact of the measures of this bill on the day-to-day business of your organisation?
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me. I'm Rachel Kelly. I'm Assistant Director of Tax and Finance Policy at the British Property Federation. We represent members who invest in property across the UK. So our investors are typically long-term institutional investors in all sorts of commercial property, the traditional asset classes, retail, logistics, offices, but also newer asset classes, data centres, lab space, GP surgeries, etc. Just to give you that background. We've lobbied on business rates for a very long time. We are big stakeholders in property, and we want to see a functional, fair, responsive tax system. So our two kind of fundamental and long-standing asks for business rates reform are: number one, the tax burden is very high. We are over double the OECD average in terms of the property tax burden in the UK. So we have a very high tax burden on property. We would like to see that come down. This bill actually doesn't achieve that. It does the opposite, because the temporary relief for retail, hospitality and leisure had been funded by central government. This bill proposes to bring that funding within the business rate system, so that tax burden to fund the relief for some sectors will fall on all business. And our second fundamental ask or ask for reform of business rates is to have a more responsive tax system which responds more quickly to changes in the economy, more quickly to changes in rents. we would say, I mean, it's difficult to say, but this bill is quite relatively radical. It introduces new tax rates for different asset classes and also different valuation points, so it will add a bit more complexity into the system. And it will also introduce new cliff edges in the system, which arguably could create some more contention around valuations. And I know you've already heard from previous people giving evidence that there are huge backlogs within the valuation office system around appeals. Potentially with these new cliff edge points you could create more appeals. And all of that, coupled with the additional complexity, is probably going to make it even harder to automate, digitalise, kind of reach more frequent revaluations, which would be, which we think should be the ultimate goal of the business rate system.
Thank you. Perhaps I could just follow that up. As you mentioned, there are many things going on in the system at the moment which impact. But clearly that level of investor confidence is absolutely critical if high streets and the business environment generally is to remain vibrant. What's your view about the impact of the measures of this bill on investor confidence? And are there any particular points that you think either will boost that level of confidence or that would tend to dampen it down?
Yeah, I think one positive, which we've also heard from other people today, is that having stability and certainty and predictability around tax is really important for occupiers and investors alike. And so recognising that these kind of temporary retail hospitality reliefs, recognising that there's benefit to those businesses in making those permanent is a good thing. But actually government could go a lot further. So at the moment we have a tax system where the tax rate fluctuates at every valuation. So depending on the relative change in property values, the tax rate will change at each revaluation. And it goes up by inflation every year, which is unlike any other tax rate, any other business tax rate in the UK. So actually if government really want to provide certainty, stability, predictability, which is good for business, good for investors, probably the best thing they could do would be to fix the tax rate so that businesses know year on year that really the only thing that's going to change their tax bill is, you know, whether their property's gone up or down in value. And then I suppose I'd reiterate my other point. We have a property tax burden in the UK which is over double the OECD average. We're pretty much at the top in terms of the tax we levy on property in the UK. That in and of itself isn't very competitive. And similarly, I would come back to the point around more frequent evaluations. If you have a responsive tax system which reflects those property values more quickly, you're more able to support those businesses or sectors that are struggling more quickly because their valuations will reflect that more quickly, and actually better for the exchequer because as economies, as different sectors grow and improve, the exchequer can generate revenues from those sectors more quickly as well.
Thank you.
Minister Jim.
Thank you for coming to give evidence. One thing we're particularly interested in is ensuring that within the scope of the bill, so the measures that are being taken particularly on the multipliers and the reliefs, that we understand the impact on the ground in our town cities and in the wider economy. We have heard from other witnesses today about the relationship between business rates and rent levels, and in the end they are a self-correcting system when it works well. It'd be useful to get your insight from your perspective and from industry about, certainly for institutional landlords, what headroom does exist, because there are a number of us, I think, that reflect on our own local economies and see very high rent levels being quoted for properties that have been empty for many, many years and have no prospect of getting a tenant anytime soon. And it'd be helpful just to get a feel of how the system is working as an industry.
Yeah, sure. And I did listen into the sessions this morning, so I heard some of the discussion around the relationship between rent and rates. So I'll try and kind of pick up and respond to a few of those points. I mean, there clearly is a relationship between rent and rates, but as one of the people giving evidence this morning said, the evidence is very thin. We conducted some research about a decade ago, which did show that there was a relationship between rent and rates, but that relationship was not as strong in certain asset classes and in certain geographies, and it certainly is not as strong in retail. We know that for many of our high streets where you might have 20% vacancy, ultimately the occupiers have much more negotiating power in those environments, and so actually until the kind of significant supply-demand imbalance rectifies on those high streets, we would expect the kind of predominantly the benefit of a business rates discount to fall to the occupiers. You know, until such time as that supply-demand imbalance or, you know, the vacancy improves, at which point, arguably, the policy might have worked. And to the point around empty properties with artificially high rents, I mean, we represent long-term investors in property, institutional investors in property. You know, a lot of our investors in property are our pension funds, our insurance companies, etc. They want long-term income returns for their pension holders, unit holders, ultimate investors. The only rational decision for an investor is to try and seek those rental income returns. Perhaps at the margins, people do keep their properties empty, but it seems wholly irrational. It's not something that, you know, if I was an investor or a pension fund holder, I wouldn't want, you know, somebody managing those assets to be keeping a property empty and not generating rental income from them. I don't think it's a pervasive issue. It's not something we see in our members, is all I can say.
And then just to come back about the targeted approach of these measures, they are very deliberately targeted at those smaller properties in retail, hospitality and leisure that are generally the backbone of our high streets and town centres, very deliberately targeted. And for your institutional members who are investors in those places, they must reflect that many of those places are really struggling. And where they may be a landlord and the demand just isn't there, it will be by and large because the business doesn't believe it can keep its head above water, notwithstanding the rent levels. And so do you and your association reflect that actually a stable system that has that permanent relief that takes away the cliff edge and the temporary support that was there from COVID and give that long-term support, in the end will be good for communities but also good for investors actually being able to fill these vacant units?
Yeah, I think having more predictability and certainty around the tax bill is important for both occupiers and investors, and that talks to my point around actually the best thing you could do would be to go further and fix the tax rate. But yes, the more predictability and stability is good for investors and occupiers alike. Does that answer your question?
I think it was more about a recognition from the industry for the institutional investors in property that actually government is going a long way to really bake into the system in a permanent way, not year-on-year release, but actually a permanent relief to fill in those units that maybe investors really struggle to let because whatever the rent levels, they're just not commercially viable for the end user. These measures will help in that end.
Yeah, I think they will go some way to helping, but I think that if the ultimate goal of this bill is to support high streets, actually there probably are areas where we would suggest that it's not as targeted as it could be. I mean, if you think of a really thriving high street in your area, yes, retail and leisure will kind of form a large part of it, but actually a thriving high street has, you know, offices and other businesses that provide footfall to those retail units. It has big anchor stores that might not benefit from this smaller relief, but again provide really important footfall for the other retail and leisure occupiers. It has car parks that are really vital to bring in customer bases for those high streets. It often has lots of other asset classes, GP surgeries, libraries, some forms of education, etc. I mean, you get my point. A thriving high street has a huge mix of different businesses all supporting each other. It's a really it's a really important and maybe fragile ecosystem. And yes, this measure will support some of those units, the retail and leisure units, the smaller ones. Whether that's enough to support that whole high street ecosystem, I'm not sure.
The other opposition spokesperson?
Yes.
Vicky Slade.
Thank you, Dr. Hook. So I completely accept the point that, you know, a lot of the talk around this bill is around high streets because of the retail, hospitality and leisure particular references, but it is a bill that affects non-domestic rating multipliers for all businesses. And I wonder whether you've got any thoughts or comments on the fact that there's no reference to manufacturing and how we support manufacturing businesses, and whether you've got any thoughts about how that should be included within the bill.
Yeah, whether it can be included in the bill or not, I don't know. But yeah, the issue of an uncompetitive property tax system is relevant for lots of industries, and manufacturing is one that you raise. And ultimately that comes back to the high rate of tax across the board. And if you're alluding to the higher tax rate for the rateable values above £500,000, yes, it strikes me as an arbitrary threshold, and it's going to capture a lot of different businesses and sectors. Maybe there'll be some adverse consequences of that that might be kind of counter to the policy aims. I'm not sure, but it's a tricky one to balance, because ultimately, if this is going to be funded within the bill, if this relief for retail, hospitality and leisure is going to be funded within the business rate system, I think our instinct is that it would be better to fund that across as broad a spectrum of the economy as possible, rather than kind of narrow down that tax base even further. So for context, the proportion of properties above £500,000 rateable value is 1% of commercial property in the UK. If we condense that down even further, it's a very, very narrow tax base to fund these other changes. So I'm not sure that's sustainable. I'm not sure we can address the issue around competitiveness for other sectors without addressing the elephant in the room, which is the huge tax rate that we have for everyone else, 55% or 50% for smaller businesses. They're very high tax rates compared to any other business tax.
Okay, thank you.
Polly Billington.
Thank you very much. Grateful to hear your evidence. Interested to hear your puzzlement about the reality of empty shops. I represent East Thanet, 3 towns, Margate, Broadstairs and Ramsgate, all of which suffer from empty shops to a greater or less extent. Ramsgate has a 24% vacancy rate. Can you explain to me how that might be and what kind of impact this kind of legislation might have on tackling some of the challenges around large property owners simply resisting taking anybody on as potential tenants?
So, the reason why we have huge vacancy on our high streets, it must be kind of multifaceted. Obviously, the kind of huge transition in our retail sector over the last 10, 15 years is going to have had a huge impact on some of our high streets. And the supply of property is relatively fixed. So once you have an oversupply, it's difficult to rectify that in the short term. And I guess our planning system will play a big role in making sure that we can reuse those assets and make sure they're being used for the most appropriate purpose for our current economy. As far as I'm aware, the biggest relationship or the causational relationship between vacancy is the disposable income of the residents of a local area. Where there's very high disposable income, there tends to be lower vacancy. Whether there's relatively low disposable income, there tends to be quite high vacancy. Talking to your point, whether there are at the margins people that keep their shops empty, as I say, it's not something that a rational investor would do. It's not something that we see.
Well, you must have a lot of irrational investors.
Well, the clerk is also telling me we're steering away from the scope. So I'm being told off for allowing this to continue. Patrick Spencer.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kelly. The premise, or at least the premise as I understand it, of this policy change is to rebalance fairness back towards local community-based properties and businesses, which I am in favour of. But can you speak to the impact that this will have on your institutional investors who invest in large warehouse space and the importance of that for the UK economy in terms of supporting our distribution networks and the many businesses that provide goods to our doorstep, and what this policy, the impacts of this change will have on those businesses?
Yeah, sure. Our whole economy is really interconnected. So you talk about these large, logistics distribution warehouses. They will be servicing parts of our retail sector as well. So in terms of the impact of this measure, I'm sure there'll be loads of impacts that are kind of impossible to predict at this point. But ultimately, by increasing the tax rate further, it does make investment in property harder. It will make occupation of property more expensive. Other than saying that at the very least it's good that the whole economy is kind of shouldering that burden of the higher tax rate, and we wouldn't want that to be intensified further, so that individual sectors are solely bearing the burden of that additional tax rate. I don't think that would be right or sustainable. Kind of ultimately, the higher tax rate will make the tax system less competitive and the occupation of property more expensive.
David Costigan, until 4 o'clock, so that is...
Just a quick one there. You said at the outset, Rachel, that you wanted the tax system to be more responsive. But wouldn't you agree that actually rebalancing the tax system in this way is being responsive to those empty shops on the high street, and also to the feeling amongst small businesses on the high street and hospitality businesses that it is those online distributors that are really not playing on a level playing field, that are getting away with being able to undercut them because the tax system doesn't currently work, and that this will give us that responsiveness that we need to level that up?
Yes and no. I mean, I think that ultimately, if you take a step back, business rates is a tax on the occupation of property, and it's levied based on the value of that property. So if you occupy more valuable property, you'll pay more tax. So that's the business rate system is kind of working as the policy intended with that respect. But in terms of making it fairer, I think the best thing you can do is to value property more frequently. Retail rents have been falling for the last 10-15 years. So in the decade from 2010 to 2020, rents came down 30%. Business rates did not for that sector. So, rents are negotiable, rents do respond, it's business rates that haven't. And if revaluations had kept up with rents, retail would have been paying much less, much earlier. Other sectors that had been growing would have been paying more, much more quickly. So, to my mind, the best way to introduce fairness into the system is to value properties more frequently.
Order. That's the end of this particular session.
Chair, may I just raise a point of order?
Point of order, David Simmons.
Thank you. I just wanted to check on timings for today's committee. I think the invitations that were sent out to secure members' time concluded this committee today at 4 o'clock and 4 o'clock tomorrow. I'm aware other members have...
No, we're going on till 5, although there will be votes that will... Okay. 4:40, I thought 5 o'clock. These were all decisions by the programming subcommittee.
Yes. So if I may, I'm
all those days ago.
referring to the diary invitations that were sent out. So we have a separate information that's been sent to members' diaries electronically from what's on the agreed programme. I just wanted to make sure that we could confirm with members. I'm more than happy to stay here to conclude today's business, but we need to make sure members know what time they need to put
Okay, it does sound like a mismatch between communications. The clerks will follow up on that. Votes are going to mess up the timings again. All right, we have our next witness, which is Professor Francis Green, Professor of Work and Education Economics at UCL. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm exactly that, Professor of Education and Economics at UCL, and someone who's done some research on private schools. And
brilliant. Yeah. Theoretically, we've got until 4:20, but we are expecting to be interrupted. Anyway, David Simmons, Shadow Minister.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Huck. Welcome, Professor. I'd be grateful if you could set out initially what your view is about the impact the measures in this bill will have, in particular, on the education sector, in which you are an expert.
In one word, marginal, because the sums are not enormous. I made an estimate, which is now about a couple of years out of date, which suggested that the amount of tax subsidy was in the order of £142 million across England as a whole. In today's money, that's probably about £150 million, which is, I think you'll appreciate, not enormous in the big scheme of things. But nonetheless, I think it's probably a fairly fair policy, if you're asking my opinion, insofar as, well, I think of my own town, which is Canterbury, which has quite a few private schools, including the very oldest private school in the country, King's School, which owns a lot of property around the town, but pays only currently 1/5 of the local taxes, which it would otherwise do. And it seems to me that by subsidising them, we're subsidising mainly rich people.
Thank you. So marginal is a helpful description because we know this is about a very specific, narrow bill. But clearly, it is part of a bigger context. Now, I'll ask if you could perhaps outline, especially as we know marginal impacts can be felt much more strongly in certain contexts than others, especially if some business or any other institution is rather closer to the edge financially than an equivalent counterpart in another location, except King's Canterbury, although I'm not familiar with it, may be extremely well padded in terms of its margins. That won't necessarily be the case everywhere. So in terms of the educational impact that may follow from overall changes, that would reduce on the impact of provision, reduce the impact of provision, or impact on the ability of some affected schools to make their facilities available to other schools in a local area. Whether you have any view about that at all.
I don't think it will have a great deal of effect. I offer you a small piece of evidence for that, which is in the case of Scotland, which took this measure, or an equivalent measure, 2.5 years ago, and there was much protest beforehand from the sector that this would not only reduce the numbers attending the schools, but also reduce their ability to finance bursaries, which make a small difference, as you know, to making the schools a little bit less exclusive. But the evidence to date just shows no noticeable difference whatsoever. It's perhaps too soon to tell, but you see no collapse, no catastrophes as was predicted beforehand. That's one small piece of evidence that I would offer you. I really don't think it'll make that great deal of difference.
His Majesty's Government, Ministers, Jim Lenon.
Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to give evidence, and also for your, I think, very direct and matter-of-fact responses, which I think, in a debate that can be emotive, is very much welcomed in what is an evidence committee. Now, obviously, from the government's point of view, we want to make sure that in seeing this legislation through, that we do fully take into account the likely impact it has, both on the school system and on the individual pupils and parents. But the fact is that most schools will seek to absorb this like they would any other operating cost. And it would be helpful to understand, if you have made an assessment, what the assessment has been of the likely displacement from the independent sector to the state sector of pupils as a result of this particular measure.
I've made no direct assessment of this particular measure, but I have made estimates using econometric studies of the impact of the imposition of VAT, which I know is not under discussion today, but in terms of the magnitude of the sums involved, this is much less. And well, the best estimates of from the econometric studies suggest somewhere between 10 and 30,000 children might, over a course of time, be switched away from the private sector. But if we now take, let's say, it's now about 1/10 in terms of the sums, so you can see that's relatively small. Now, I will admit that there's a certain degree of uncertainty in these estimates. We do not know, to be precise, but I'm prepared to put my money on it that it won't be a vast amount. But probably it couldn't be tested because the small changes that will occur, it would be very difficult to say, well, that's because of this, rather than the many other changes which happen to, the circumstances of the particular market.
Thank you. My next point is the accommodation that we have sought to make for SEND pupils, and in particular those schools that have a majority of pupils in that category. We do recognise that is an important part of the school system overall, and actually many councils will contract to those schools to make sure that children who need that support get that provision. What's your assessment of the impact on that particular cohort children as a result of these measures, because I think we do need to separate out, in my view, the overall impact across the sector and the children who are most in need of specialist support, who under the measures being proposed we are seeking to give protection to.
Well, I understand that the private schools which mainly or wholly provide private children who've had an assessment are excluded from this, and they will continue to receive relief as before. There may be some children who are not quite over the threshold, if you like, for an SEH assessment, and I don't think there will be a large number who are affected, but it's hard to tell exactly how much that will be. I don't expect to be a large assessment, a large impact there.
Thank you.
Vicky Slade. Thank you. So we heard earlier that there are apparently 130,000 children with special educational needs in independent schools, of which 100,000 don't have an EHCP. So if you assume that those are the majority of those are not in specialist EHCP SEND schools, there's a potential of 100,000 children who might make that switch. What do you think do you have any thoughts on how many of those schools might be pushed towards specialising in special educational needs? Have you got any idea of whether we might see a shift in what private schools choose to specialise in going forward?
That's an interesting thought, and I don't have a specialist estimate to give you on that. And it's a conceivable response. Not sure that it's necessarily a bad response if it does happen that way. Again, I repeat, I don't think there'll be a large number in those circumstances. Inevitably, whenever you do a change like this, there's always someone at the margin who just kind of tipped over the edge. Yeah. So I really can't afford this anymore. I happen to know somebody in that particular position in my area, but
so be it.
I'm fairly sure that the large number of those people will have to deal with a situation if there's maybe a 1 or 2% rise in the prices, which might not otherwise have happened. But of course, prices rise all the time. Prices have gone up a large number of times since the turn of the century, and they continue to go on up. So it'd be very hard to distinguish the price rises associated with this from the regular price rises and the fee rises, that go on anyway.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Professor Green, for joining us this afternoon. You've noted a couple of times already that your assessment is that the impact of the measure we're discussing today is probably going to be negligible. I was wondering how you might compare that to the cash terms doubling of private school fees over the last 20 years from the perspective of families.
Well, I think that's part of the indirect evidence, the fact that there won't be a great deal of impact, because broadly speaking, the same proportion of the population is attending private schools as they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So it's one of those constants. It's slightly down, but to be honest, what it depends is on the fortunes of the top echelons of our income and wealth spectrum as to how much they can afford and choose to send their children to private school. That's the nature of the market.
Patrick Spencer.
Thank you very much, Chair. So, sorry, Professor, can we just go back? You said that there would be 10 to 20,000 students you expect would transition out of independent schools into the state system?
10 to 30, somewhere between 10 and 30.
My so
middle estimate
we'll
would
go
be
midway at 20,000.
20, and this would be over a 5-year period.
So a 3.5% reduction in the total independent school population.
Yes, I think that's
and
right.
As a consequence of everything that's going on within the context, or just the business rate changes? Do the parameters of that analysis include VAT?
That's the VAT estimate.
Okay.
So what I'm saying is, if that's the VAT estimate, the business rate relief change is 1/10 of that.
This is. I just want to clarify that analysis was based on the total changes that the sector is undergoing, not just specifically the context of the bill we're discussing.
Correct.
If that's the end of all our questions for this witness, thank you, Professor Green. And then we move on to our next panel. 11th panel of witnesses until 4:40, or when the vote comes and interrupts it. We now hear oral evidence from Jim McMahon, Minister for English Devolution in the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government.
Oh, right.
So we have until 4:40, but if it's interrupted, then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Minister, I think, needs no introduction, probably, and there's probably loads of members who want to ask questions, but we will start with the Shadow Minister. Do we? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Hope. I know we're going to have ample opportunity to develop the debate about the clauses of the bill tomorrow. I just wanted to perhaps ask Minister, a lot of the amendments are around impact assessments being carried out or not, and how that would inform our decision making. I just wonder if you could be able to set out the department's approach in general to the use of impact assessments in making determinations, for example, setting the particular level of multipliers, either that Treasury would consider as an envelope, or that you would expect then to see implemented by billing authorities.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's important to say that we are determined in these measures to create a fairer business rate system that protects the high street, supports the investment and is fit for the 21st century. And to deliver that pledge, you've got the measures that I've outlined that have been well rehearsed during the evidence session and that we'll explore further in committee tomorrow. We've been very clear in targeting the interventions here because, one, it's about delivering a manifesto commitment to make sure that we better reflect the changing nature of the high street. And in every community, you will hear local businesses who are at their wits' end, feeling as though government hasn't been present when the online world is growing at a rate of knots and the high street is getting more and more difficult. And all of us see that across the board. And where there's been particular pressure in retail, hospitality and leisure has been the COVID period that's seen many go to the wall, but I think reflect that the COVID support that was on offer managed to get a number through what was a very difficult period. But they knew, even within that 75% relief, that that was coming to an end. It was a cliff edge. There was no accounting for it going forward, and there's no provision for it going forward. And everybody in this room must have heard businesses say, we don't know what's coming, and we're nervous about the future. And so this is about providing that permanent relief. The 40% will make a huge difference to high streets, town centres and communities across the country. But it's also about giving certainty so businesses can plan ahead. And so within that, we're very confident that these are the measures that have been asking for. Now, it's got to be self-financing. If we've learned anything, there is no magic money tree. And if we give in one part of the economy, it's got to come from another part of the economy. And so we're best to provide that rebalancing from. And the fairest way is to target those higher value properties, 1% of the system, to say we do need you to give a bit more in because the high street and communities need that back support. And that will mean, in by and large, it'll be the warehousing, the distribution, the large sheds that are on the side of motorways, and quite rightly too, because they are doing well, their turnover is high, and that can be used to support local businesses on the high street and in town centres. And every evidence that we've heard today, whether it's from the pub industry, whether it's from retail, even from property investors, are all saying the clarity on certainty of investment on business rates is really important, and that is welcomed. The impact it's going to have in terms of the reach it will have across a range of different sectors will definitely have an impact. and also the fairness in the system, that those, if you like, with the broader shoulders, those highest value properties over 500 is absolutely what's needed. So in terms of the impact, we are very clear on this. Now clearly this is only one part of the process. The actual rates will come later, and that will be subject to a separate process. But in terms of the impact, we are absolutely clear that this is the right thing to do, and it's been noted by the evidence sessions that we've had today.
Thank you. Can I just ask a question around occupation and occupation? Because I think, just thinking about, honourable member for East Thanet, I also represent a coastal community, and I think it was a slightly surprised response when we heard that these businesses are all, it'll right itself when we've got whole high streets that are sitting empty. My understanding is that if you have a higher rates for empty properties, it's likely to actually force people to take a tenant. Do you think this bill goes far enough to that, or do you think there are more levers you need to be pushing to go to make those empty properties work? I know we've already got the rental auction, so I'm aware of that's not in the scope. But does this go far enough, or can the multipliers be levered even more?
It will. I mean, we do need to stay in the scope of the bill, but the bill doesn't sit in isolation. This is a wider package of reform. It's a wider package of intervention. And it's reflecting, of course, these are businesses, but they don't operate in isolation. They are part of an ecosystem in many places. Just think about the impact of, say, an Anchor department store closing, or a bank branch, or a post office closing, or an office block closing. What that does to the footfall in a place has a huge impact. And so there are a range of measures that need to be taken to here. But we absolutely understand the importance of town centres and high streets, not just a part of the economy, that's important, but also for identity, pride and confidence in the future. And what we do here, and I'm careful not to stray too far, is the lack of power often that communities feel to take control of their high streets where units have been vacant, and actually there is a local business who would take it on, but the landlord is not interested, either because they're absent and missing in action, or because actually they're an investor where the book value is more important than the actual rent that can be achieved. And things like the community right to buy, that give the community the right to have assets, having a community asset register, so assets of community value have that protection is important, but also giving more time for communities to self-organise, to maybe take over some of these assets as well. So this is an important step, and it will go some way to that, but in isolation it wouldn't be enough, which is why the other steps that we're taking will make a difference. Where this will make an absolute difference is once we've dealt with the empty property, it means that the business that then that occupies it then onwards can be that bit more viable, because the business rates will be lessened on its operating costs.
Okay, thanks.
Adam Thompson.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister, for your time as well. I think it's been a really interesting session throughout today. And, I represent two towns, as I said earlier, and actually I'm really pleased that we've got one of those towns where a lot of work has been put in by the community to rejuvenate some of the town centre itself. By working together, the occupancy rate has increased, and we've got a huge focus on independent businesses. I think that's really positive. I want to focus, though, Minister, on some of the pubs, because I think that maybe had a little less focus than we had earlier. And I know, like many colleagues, I wouldn't be here sat in this room if it wasn't for the emotional and social support of the White Lion and the Dewdrop throughout my campaign. I just wanted to ask, Minister, what's your feeling about the opportunities that are going to be opened for the pub sector by the bill that we're hoping to move forward today?
Well, I mean, I think we heard earlier on in the evidence session that for those community pubs, and I know a lot of talk is given about the last pub in a village, and they are lifelines. I mean, if everything else has gone and the shop has closed and maybe you don't have the post office anymore, having a convenient space where the community can come together for a number of reasons, not just for social isolation, that's important, but actually just to live a decent, fulfilled life where those relationships and experiences matter. Actually, quite a lot less is spoken about the last pub on the estate. And I would say, in a way that many rural villages feel isolated and disconnected, there are lots of estates that feel completely disconnected from a lot else in terms of convenience stores, in terms of the things that used to be there that maybe aren't there anymore, like the local church or the church hall or the scout hall perhaps, where actually we need to do far more to make sure that the convenience store can survive and thrive, that the local pub can survive and thrive. And we heard in the evidence session that given where the thresholds are being set, those are exactly the type of places that will be the biggest beneficiaries of some of these measures. But actually the high street, which is obviously a bit more expensive to operate on because of the nature of the rateable values, will also be the beneficiaries of this because it is so targeted on retail, hospitality and leisure that those types of uses that will be the backbone of the high street and town centres will benefit. And the same will be true of pubs. Those community pubs, those village pubs, but also extending on the pubs in the high streets and town centres will be in scope to be the beneficiaries of these. And we did hear in the evidence session that almost like the mounting pressures, and we heard there around food costs, around energy costs. I know that CO2 supply, for carbonated drinks, and the cost of that was extremely high as well, staffing costs. The scope of this bill is narrow, it's targeted. There are limitations to what it can do. It can't fix absolutely everything in the system, but it can play its part. And as a part of the answer, I think we heard today in the evidence session that it's absolutely welcomed.
Spencer.
Forgive me, is this not a bit of a missed opportunity? Because we've heard a lot today from people who have come before this panel to say, yes, the measures introduced in this bill are probably very fair, specifically the ones around supporting those local shops and supporting our high street, very fair, very reasonable at about time. But business rates are, at the end of the day, not a progressive way to tax individuals and businesses. Taxing capital always allows for businesses that may seem asset rich or indeed have asset liabilities to be taxed unfairly. Why did the government not go further in looking at alternatives, whether that's a sales tax, a land value tax, which I'm not a fan of and is another form of a capital tax, but why didn't the government look at being more ambitious instead of retaining an existing system that may be better in the future but is still not ideal?
Well, it would be fair to say what taxes are fair are always in the eye of the beholder. People have very different views about the fairness of different taxes in the system. But with property tax, and obviously I'm here as the local tax minister covering business rates and council tax, they are established taxed, they are understood. There are definitely views about whether they are up to date and fit for purpose and whether they should or shouldn't be reformed. But however clunky the system is, very few people have got an alternative that holds water, that stands up, that is fair and produces the same levels of income to support local public services. And so it's always that balance. And I think with business rates, you are getting the balance between the inherent value of a property and the rent that it can achieve, and that link to capital. And we have heard there are contradictions in some of that in some places where the economy is more suppressed. But it's not entirely intended to do that anyway. It is about reflecting the activity that takes place within it as much as the bricks and mortar that it occupies. And I think on that basis, it's probably as good as you're going to get. The question comes for government, how do you build into it a safety net for those types of uses that you want to maintain because they're positive uses for the local community and the economy, but maybe commercially are marginal, and that's exactly what this is intended to do. But in a self-financing system, which the business rate system is, how do you then draw it from other parts of the system in the fairest possible way? And I think we have achieved that. Why? Because it's £500,000 rateable value, it's 1% of the business rate system, and it's targeting the warehouses, the distribution centres, for the companies that by and large doing well, when I would say most on the high street, in retail, hospitality and leisure. Think about the restaurants, think about the fashion retailers, think about the pubs, are saying we are only just keeping our head above water. So in a system that anybody would say is quite clunky, I think this is as good as you will get at rebalancing fairness, but also being targeted enough to get the outcome that you want, which are thriving high streets and local communities that can begin to be proud of the places where they live because they're seeing the activity and not windows boarded up and roller shutters pulled down.
Thank you, Chair. This
It's just kind of a point of clarification for me, really. It's probably really simple. It's just for the larger rate over 500,000. That lower multiplier, one of the witnesses said for hospitality, retail, etc., that could still apply. So those big hotels, those grassroots music venues, even if they're over that level, could still have that applied. Is that right? Have I got that right?
Well, at the moment, any property over the £500,000 would be subject to the higher value. We're not looking at the moment at sectoral exemptions for that. But clearly, we're taking into account the evidence sessions. We're going to take into account the discussions that have been heard tomorrow. But it would be fair to say that if you're a retailer with a square footage and a value over £500,000, you are likely to be a very big department store, a big out-of-town shed, or a supermarket. And the assumption in the system is if you can afford to occupy and run a space of that size, then there is room to pay for the additional business rates on that basis. Because in the end, it is about getting it to the ultimate use, which is for the retail, hospitality and leisure of those smaller uses that are the backbone of many communities.
Thank you. And thank you, Minister. Going back to panel 7, where we're hearing from UKHospitality, the Institute of Innkeepers and Nighttime Economy Advisor for Greater Manchester, and we're reflecting on jobs and job losses as a account of changes. And I appreciate that they're reflecting on it's very hard to establish at this stage whether it's because of national insurance or business rates, but either way it's a contributing factor. What analysis has the government done in the background of this bill to actually model what the impacts on jobs and job losses in the different sectors might be, and on that as well, on the different types of employment, whether it's full-time, part-time, seasonal? Obviously, a lot of hospitality work really helps people like working mothers or part-time working mothers because it's different times of day. And what impacts had we done on all of that?
Well, I think within the scope of the bill, which is very narrow, the impact is only a positive one in the context of the temporary relief that was provided through COVID, being that a temporary relief, it was coming to an end, the cliff edge was coming. There was absolutely no finance provided for it beyond the current year. And so the question then comes, so what does government do about it? We either grow the £22 billion funding gap that was here when we came to office even further to continue it, or we say that we're in a system, we need to create a more sustainable...
10 minutes ago you said we have to look at these changes, in the scope of all the other changes as well. So I think it's not unreasonable to look at it as a whole, given what you said 10 minutes ago.
As in the interventions that the government are taking, but in the scope of the bill, this is the relief, the much needed relief that retail, hospitality and leisure need, and every one of the witnesses who came to talk about the impact of it within the scope of the bill.
So was there a job analysis done in the scope of this bill?
We're very positive about the impact that it has. There'll be lots of other changes that are coming through the system. We've still got yet to do the revaluation. We've still got yet, of course, through the next fiscal programme to talk about the rates, and that type of analysis will be done later in the stage. But to be clear, although there was definitely a lot of context about the operating environment being very challenging, and there's only so much you can do within months of coming into office, every witness on the small business rate issue on retail, hospitality and leisure said this will play a part in supporting those local businesses to be more sustainable in the future. The other issues are well outside of the scope of this bill.
So it could have had a positive impact on jobs, but we don't know because we haven't had an analysis.
Well, if we're giving a tax relief to retail, hospitality and leisure for almost all community operators, convenience stores or pubs or another, and we're doing the same for town centres, for city centres, for high streets, then the answer is self-evident that will be a positive outcome.
I think it might be a bit of a broader principle of it's also value for money. If you're giving a tax relief somewhere, you'd want to know what the impact on that is. For example, if it is on job growth, that's great, but we do not want to know what the impact of it is on this versus if you'd spent that money elsewhere. So surely, whether it's positive or negative, an analysis is a really important part of seeing if money is being spent and used in the most efficient way possible.
And that will be considered in the round, but to be clear, this was a manifesto commitment to rebalance the on-street with the online, to get back to support in the high street, to give sustained support for those businesses that are the backbone of our community, and this is delivering that manifesto commitment. We don't shy away from that. We're very proud that we're in the first 6 months that this legislation is coming and businesses will feel it in every community in the country.
Right. Right, 8 minutes left, 5 people still, and a vote any second now. Deirdre across the group.
Thank you, Minister. And I know you're a former local government yourself, so I just wanted to ask about local councils and what support will be there to ensure that they're able to administer this and help support rebalancing the high street in a way I know that all local authorities do want to do.
Well, again, there is a wider context here about ending that cap-in-hand bidding process where the previous government aligned councils one by one, getting them to compete with each other for actually a very restricted pot of money to support local high street improvements. In the end, we have got to provide a fairer way of funding local councils. That's got to be based on need, and I'll be careful again not to kind of get ahead of the provisional settlement next week, but measures will be very clear in there about the intent and the direction of travel. But in the end, it is about making sure that councils have the resources needed to make sure that wherever the council is, outside of a bidding war competition, in the way that we saw previously, that they have the resources to intervene on the high street. Resources are part of that, but the powers are important as well. So the community right to buy, the asset register, having that proper period to be able to self-organise is part of that. And this measure is about making sure that when the businesses are open and they're operating, that they're sustainable businesses because the tax burden from business rates is fair and equitable.
Thank you, Chair. Very welcome to sort of reform business rates. We always like that. They're not a particularly good tax. I fear this is making it more complicated. Forgive me if this is a naive question, but I don't see anywhere in here, other than this starting in April 26, any commitment to forward notice of changes or forward ability to see it. I mean, one presumes this comes once a year in the budget, but I'm not sure it's actually mandated that that is the case. Is there any mechanism in here that prevents future governments from changing these rates on a more frequent basis? Or is there anything that we can put in here that gives, following on the previous question, local authorities sufficient time to implement such things? You say the provisional statement, which is due next week, which is once again, as a former council leader, a very, very late provisional statement. You're forgiven it's the first year, so there is extenuating circumstances. However, councils need time to set their budgets and set their systems and do all of that. So I'm looking for lead times, implementation times, guarantees of multiple years, rates for consistency.
Great. Well, that's precisely why we have phased the approach. So the 26-27 is when the permanent release will come in at the 40%, but we have included a transition period. That will continue the 110 cap. But it will bring in the 40% relief. So the relief will be out the door immediately, but it will give time for a number of things in the system to catch up. The revaluation being a very important part of that, of course. In terms of the wider issue of local government funding, of which this is part, and there are measures in this bill that will see additional business rate funding to councils, because of course some of that is retained business rates in the system. We are going a long way, and I would say that the settlement that was had, again without getting ahead of the provisional settlement next week, was a good settlement. There is £4 to £5 billion of new clean money going into local government, and all of the issues that you will know as a council leader previously are the absolute pressure points on social care, on children's services, on temporary accommodation. All of those issues are being addressed through the budget and the provisional settlement, and also importantly bringing back deprivation as a key indicator of demand that's driving many of those services in local communities. So we're going a long way to that, and we are making sure that councils are given the certainty capacity, and so we do accept the settlement this year is cutting it to the wire, and it would have been nice to get it sooner, but I think getting it right is important. But as we move further, going to those multi-year settlements, so councils have that long-term stability in the way that we're building certainty into the business rate system is absolutely the intention.
Michelle Welsh.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Minister. Can the Minister set out the scheme the government proposes to ensure that schools which are principally delivering education for special educational needs will not face any additional burdens?
Well, I think that's entirely the point, and it maybe didn't quite come out in the evidence sessions before, where quite a lot of this debate can be quite polarised really about whether you are for or not private schools and the rest of it. And I was very clear when I was on the other side of the table to kind of pull away from that and say, well, let's just have a conversation based on the evidence. And what the evidence says is that there has been provision provided to make sure that those schools that are mainly or wholly for the provision of special educational needs will not be affected by these measures at all. Why? Because we do recognise that within the wider school ecosystem, in many communities, that is a provision that is important and that many local authorities will support. So that is being provided in here. In the end, I would say, though, that we need to rebuild mainstream provision. You know, all of us have constituents that are at their wits' end because after 14 years, frankly, mainstream provision has been allowed to be eroded to such a point that in some places it does barely exist. And so we need to rebuild that. And so to see the type of investment that we had through the autumn statement begins that rebuilding work. It will take time. You know, there's no button to press that resets 14 years in 6 months. But in terms of statement of intent, you know, £1 billion through the local government finance settlement for SEND provision is start of that rebuilding process.
Thank you, Doctor. So Queen Street in Morley, fantastic high street, but it has a number of empty shops that I tried to acquire when I was making an attempt to set up my constituency office, and they told me that no, we're about to be occupied. 6 months later, they're still not occupied, and I promise it's not just down to me. They didn't just want me. Other people have approached them and had no luck. Please, can you shed some light on how we might use multipliers to get these properties occupied?
Well, I definitely can't guarantee the landlord had anything about the tenants in that situation, but I think all of us will know of examples of prime retail properties on the high street, sometimes in fantastic historic buildings, where we know that local businesses have tried to get hold of the landlord, and when they eventually do, find it very frustrating if they get a response at all. And sometimes if they do get a response, it is the type of response that you got, which actually doesn't bear truth when you think 6 months down the line the building is still empty. There's a wider issue here about the powers that community have to take over those assets and to run for the public interest, not just kind of a distant investor interest. But these measures in the scope of the bill will go a long way to make sure that when they are occupied, that the occupant of that premises gets the support they need to be sustainable in the long term.
Thank you.
Consideration of this bill be now adjourned.
Order. I'm afraid that brings us to the end of the allotted time for the committee to ask questions to the Minister and for this sitting. Thank all the witnesses for their evidence and to all the members for their patience. This brings us to the end of today's session. The committee will resume again tomorrow, 11:30. Line by line consideration of the whip in Committee Room 9, is it? It's not in here. In Committee Room 9, I invite the Government Whip to move the adjournment. She's done it. She's done it. The question is that further consideration of this bill be now adjourned. If many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Order.